The photograph was taken from across the street. High angle, probably 4th floor, maybe 5th. The camera was expensive, professional grade, the kind the NYPD intelligence division kept for surveillance operations they'd later deny existed. The date stamp read June 3rd, 1928. The location, 135th Street and 7th Avenue, right in front of the Renaissance Casino. And in the center of the frame, perfectly in focus, was a group of men and women dressed like they owned the city. Which, in a very real sense, they did. There were 12 of them. 3 women in fur coats despite the summer heat. 9 men in tailored suits that cost more than most Harlem families made in a month. They were laughing, one of the women throwing her head back, hand on someone's shoulder. They looked like movie stars, like royalty, like people who'd never worried about money or power, or where their next meal was coming from. And that photograph, that single image, was filed in a manila folder labeled Negro Agitators and Criminal Elements, ongoing surveillance. Because that's what the NYPD called them. Agitators, criminals, threats to public order. But those 12 people in that photograph controlled more actual power in Harlem than the police, the mayor's office, and the municipal government combined. They just didn't control it officially. They didn't have badges or titles or government appointments. They had something else. Something the system couldn't quite name and definitely couldn't stop. They had money that moved independent of white banks. They had justice that operated outside white courts. They had enforcement that didn't require police permission. They had what every government fears most: parallel authority, the ability to govern without asking. And by 1928, Harlem had been under surveillance for nearly 2 decades because of it. This isn't a story about rebellion. It's not about protest or resistance in the traditional sense. This is about something far more threatening to power structures: replacement. The creation of a complete, functioning alternative to the official system. Not criminal chaos, governmental infrastructure. Built quietly, operated efficiently, funded continuously, by people America refused to let participate in legitimate governance. The woman throwing her head back laughing in that photograph? That was Madame C.J. Walker's daughter, Alelia Walker, who'd turned her mother's hair care fortune into patronage of every black artist, writer, and intellectual in Harlem. The man standing next to her, hand in his pocket, looking directly at the camera like he knew exactly where it was, that was Casper Holstein, who controlled the numbers banking operation that generated more revenue than most legitimate businesses in New York. The woman in the white fur, smaller than the others, but somehow commanding attention, that was Stephanie St. Clair, who'd later go to war with Dutch Schultz and refused to surrender, even when surrender meant survival. 12 people, 12 centers of power, 12 reasons the NYPD kept taking photographs and filing reports and monitoring activities that were, technically, legal. Because they weren't just committing crimes. They were building institutions. And institutions don't disappear when you arrest someone. They persist. They grow. They become permanent. That's what made them dangerous. That same day, June 3rd, 1928, 3 blocks north on 138th Street, a detective named John Ryan was sitting in an unmarked car, writing in a notebook. He'd been assigned to Harlem surveillance for 6 months. His notes were meticulous, detailed, and increasingly frustrated. Subject A departed residence at 9:47 a.m., he wrote, met with Subject C at Renaissance Casino. Conversation lasted 47 minutes. Observed handshake between Subject C and Subject F, possibly monetary exchange. No probable cause for arrest. No visible criminal activity. Recommend continued surveillance. No probable cause. That phrase appeared in Ryan's reports 73 times over 6 months. He was watching crime happen. He was certain of it. He could feel it. But he couldn't prove it. Because the crime wasn't street-level dealing or violent enforcement. The crime was structural, economic, political. The crime was building power in a system designed to prevent exactly that. Detective Ryan had no language for what he was witnessing, no legal framework, no precedent, because America had never confronted this particular problem before. What happens when people you've excluded from legitimate power simply build their own power structure instead. Not underground, not hidden. Right in front of you, photographed and documented and operating in broad daylight, just legally ambiguous enough that you can watch but not stop. That was Harlem in 1928. But to understand how Harlem became America's most watched neighborhood, how it developed this parallel power structure that required constant surveillance, you have to go back. Back before the photographs, before the money, before the elite. Back to when Harlem was just a neighborhood at the edge of Manhattan that nobody white wanted. Back to the moment when geography became destiny. Back to 1900. Harlem in 1900 was a real estate disaster. Beautiful brownstones built for wealthy white families who never came. Speculative development that collapsed when the subway route changed. Property values plummeting. Owners desperate. And into this vacuum walked a black man named Philip Payton Jr. with an idea that would reshape American urban geography. He called it the Afro-American Realty Company. The pitch was simple. Let black families rent your empty buildings. We'll pay on time, maintain the properties, cause no trouble. The white landlords were skeptical, then desperate, then willing. And in 1904, the first black families began moving into buildings on 134th Street. Within 5 years, they'd moved into blocks from 135th to 145th Street. Within 10 years, Harlem had transformed from a failed white neighborhood into the largest concentrated black community in America. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is why they stayed. Why Harlem didn't just become another neighborhood black people passed through on their way to somewhere else. Why it became the capital, the center, the place where power accumulated instead of dispersing. The answer is brutally simple. They had nowhere else to go. Not because they didn't try, because every other option was systematically closed. By 1915, you could map black exclusion in New York City with geographic precision. Below 110th Street, landlords wouldn't rent to black families regardless of income. Brooklyn had neighborhood associations that existed solely to keep black families out. Queens was farmland and hostility. The Bronx had restrictive covenants written into property deeds, making it illegal to sell to black buyers. Every direction was blocked, every expansion prevented. Every attempt to disperse was met with violence, legal obstruction, or simple refusal. So Harlem became a funnel. Every black person arriving in New York from the South, from the Caribbean, from anywhere, got directed to the same 20-block radius. Not by choice, by elimination of alternatives. In 1910, about 50,000 black people lived in Harlem. By 1920, that number was 150,000. Same geographic area, triple the population, and the people arriving weren't random. They were selected, self-selected through the act of migration itself. Because leaving the South in 1915 wasn't a casual decision. It was dangerous. It required resources, courage, planning. The people who made that journey were, by definition, the ones willing to take risks for better opportunities. The ambitious ones. The ones who looked at sharecropping or domestic service and said, no, there has to be something else. And they all arrived in the same neighborhood. James Weldon Johnson, who'd later document this transformation, described it in 1930. Harlem is not a slum. It's a city within a city. It has its own economy, its own governance, its own aristocracy. The only difference is that none of it is official. He was right. But he was also understating it. Because what was happening in Harlem wasn't just community building. It was pressure. Literal pressure. Thousands of people with money, ambition, and skills compressed into a geographic area that couldn't expand. In normal circumstances, that pressure would dissipate. People would spread out, but the boundaries were rigid, enforced, patrolled. So the pressure had nowhere to go but up. Up into organization, up into hierarchy, up into power structures. By 1920, you could see it forming if you knew what to look for. The legitimate economy was thriving. Black-owned businesses on every block. Doctors, lawyers, undertakers, shopkeepers. The Amsterdam News reporting on community affairs. churches with thousands of members and social welfare programs, the NAACP establishing its national headquarters on Fifth Avenue. This was the visible layer, the official Harlem, the part white America occasionally praised as evidence that black people could succeed if they just worked hard enough. But underneath that, something else was building. Something the official economy couldn't accommodate because the official economy was deliberately limited. Black doctors could practice in Harlem, but couldn't admit patients to white hospitals. Black lawyers could try cases, but faced judges and juries that didn't consider them equals. Black business owners could operate shops, but couldn't get loans from white banks. Every legitimate avenue of power accumulation had a ceiling, a hard limit enforced by law, custom, and violence. So the ambitious ones, the ones who arrived in Harlem looking for opportunity and found artificial constraints, did what ambitious people always do when legitimate paths are blocked. They built illegitimate ones. In 1920, a man named Casper Holstein arrived in Harlem from the Virgin Islands. He was 39 years old. He had a 6th grade education and $50 in his pocket. He worked as a porter, then a doorman, then a building superintendent. He saved money. He watched. He learned. And what he learned was that there was more money moving through Harlem's informal economy than through any bank. The numbers racket had existed for years. Small-time gambling where you picked 3 numbers, and if they matched the last 3 digits of the next day's stock market trades, you won. Penny bets, nickel payouts, street-level hustlers running operations out of barbershops and bars. It was small, disorganized, local. Holstein looked at it and saw something nobody else did. Structure, predictability, scale. He started consolidating, buying out small operators, standardizing the payout ratios, creating central collection points, hiring runners who worked on salary instead of commission so they wouldn't skim, building accounting systems, establishing territories. Within 3 years, he was processing thousands of bets daily. Within 5 years, he was the largest numbers banker in Harlem. Within 7 years, he was generating revenue that exceeded most legitimate businesses in New York. And he did it all without a single interaction with the formal financial system. No bank loans, no business licenses, no tax returns, no legal recognition. He built a multi-million-dollar enterprise in the shadow economy because the legitimate economy wouldn't let him build anything equivalent in the light. But Holstein wasn't unique. He was just the most successful example of a pattern repeating across Harlem. Stephanie St. Clair arrived from Martinique in 1912 and built her own numbers operation independent of Holstein's. Henry Miro controlled policy games. Marcelino controlled sports betting, each of them generating massive revenue. Each of them operating outside the official financial system. Each of them accumulating power that had nowhere to go except into Harlem itself, because they couldn't invest it anywhere else. This is the part most histories miss. They focus on the crime, the illegality, the exploitation, all of which was real. But they miss the reason it became so organized, so powerful, so institutional. The money had nowhere to go. A white gangster making millions in the 1920s could buy property in Manhattan, invest in legitimate businesses, move his family to Connecticut, send his kids to private schools. He could launder money into legitimacy, but black gangsters couldn't do any of that. Every investment had to stay in Harlem. Every dollar had to circulate inside the same 20-block radius. The money couldn't escape. So it accumulated, compressed, became concentrated power. By 1925, there was more liquid capital moving through Harlem's informal economy than through its banks. There were more disputes resolved through unofficial mediation than through courts. There were more jobs created by illegal enterprises than by legitimate businesses. Not because black people were inherently criminal, because the legitimate system had been deliberately constructed to prevent black accumulation of capital and power. So capital and power accumulated anyway, just in forms the system couldn't control. And the people controlling that capital and power? They started recognizing each other, started coordinating, not formally, not explicitly, but in the way that people with aligned interests always do. Holstein knew St. Clair. St. Clair knew the owners of the Cotton Club. The club owners knew the lawyers who fixed cases. The lawyers knew the ministers who controlled voting blocks. The ministers knew the newspaper editors who shaped public opinion. Networks of mutual interest and shared exclusion. This is why Harlem became America's most watched neighborhood, not because of crime rates, not because of violence, but because it was developing independent governance, authority that operated parallel to official authority. And that's the thing systems can't tolerate. Crime they can manage, protest they can suppress. But alternative power structures, alternative ways of organizing society, that's existential. That requires surveillance, documentation, constant monitoring. Because if people realize they can govern themselves without permission, the whole legitimacy structure starts to crack. Detective Ryan, sitting in his car on 138th Street in 1928, was watching the crack form. He just didn't understand what he was seeing. He filed reports about suspicious meetings and possible criminal conspiracies. He took photographs of well-dressed people having dinner. He documented handshakes and conversations and the movement of people between locations. He was building a surveillance apparatus that would only grow larger, more sophisticated, more pervasive over the next 2 decades. Because by 1928, Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a parallel state, with its own economy generating millions annually, its own justice system resolving thousands of disputes, its own political structure influencing elections and policy, its own media shaping narratives, its own elite class making decisions that affected hundreds of thousands of lives. All of it unofficial. All of it operating in the spaces between laws. All of it built by people America refused to let participate in legitimate governance. That's not chaos. That's order. Just not the order white America authorized. And unauthorized order is always more threatening than authorized disorder. Because disorder you can contain. Order you have to acknowledge. And acknowledgement requires recognition of power. And recognition of power requires sharing power. And that's what America wasn't willing to do. So instead, they watched, and photographed, and documented, and tried to understand how people they'd excluded from power had built power anyway. Tried to find the illegality they could prosecute, the conspiracy they could break, the leader they could arrest to collapse the whole structure. But that's not how it worked. Because Harlem's power wasn't centralized. It was networked. 12 people in a photograph, each controlling a different piece. Remove one, and 11 remained. Remove 5, and the structure adapted. This wasn't a criminal organization with a boss and hierarchy. This was a functioning ecosystem with multiple power centers that balanced each other through competition and cooperation. That's what made it strong. That's what made it last. That's what made it terrifying to anyone invested in maintaining the official power structure. And at the center of this ecosystem, generating the resources that made everything else possible, was money. Massive amounts of it. Moving through channels the official system couldn't track or control or tax. Funding culture, politics, legal defense, community welfare. Criminal profits paying for legitimate black excellence. And nobody knew exactly how much money it was. Not the police, not the IRS, not the municipal government. Nobody except the people counting it at the end of each day, in apartments across Harlem, in ledgers that would never be audited, amounts that would seem impossible if anyone who didn't know better heard them. Which brings us to the foundation of everything else. The reason Harlem could build parallel power structures, the reason an elite class emerged, the reason America was watching so closely. It all came down to one thing: money. How Harlem generated it, how they controlled it, how they used it to build institutional power without anyone's permission. That's where we go next. Into the numbers racket, into the underground economy that funded the Harlem Renaissance, into the system that turned pennies from poor people into millions of dollars, and then turned those millions into power that lasted decades. Because you can't understand Harlem's elite without understanding where their power came from. And their power came from the most unlikely source imaginable: illegal gambling operations that were more organized, more efficient, and more trusted than most legitimate businesses in America. The slip of paper was smaller than a business card. 3 handwritten numbers: 472. A name, Sarah Johnson. And a date, March 15th, 1927. It looked like trash, the kind of thing you'd throw away without thinking. But that slip of paper represented a bet, 15 cents, which doesn't sound like much until you understand the system behind it. 15 cents from Sarah Johnson, and 15 cents from Mrs. Williams down the hall, and 15 cents from the porter at the building on 133rd Street, and 15 cents from the maid who worked in Greenwich Village but lived in Harlem, and 15 cents from 3,000 other people who played the numbers that Tuesday in March. 3,000 people, 15 cents each. That's $450 in one day, from one neighborhood, from one numbers bank. And there were 40 numbers banks operating in Harlem by 1927. Do the math. That's $18,000 daily, moving through an economy that operated completely outside the formal financial system. $18,000 daily equals $126,000 weekly, which equals roughly $6.5 million annually in 1927 dollars, from an operation that had no business license, no bank accounts, no corporate structure, no legal recognition whatsoever. An operation the government called criminal, but couldn't stop because it was too decentralized, too embedded, too trusted by the community it served. And that was just the numbers racket. That doesn't count policy games, sports betting, speakeasies, after-hours clubs, informal lending, or any of the other shadow economy operations generating revenue in Harlem during the 1920s. Add all of it together, and you're looking at an underground economy processing somewhere between $15 and $25 million annually, in a neighborhood where the median annual income was $1,200. This is how parallel power structures get built, not through ideology or organization or political movements, through money, massive amounts of it, flowing through channels the official system can't control, creating opportunities the legitimate economy won't provide, and most importantly, staying inside the community because it has nowhere else to go. But to understand why the numbers racket became the foundation of Harlem's power structure, you have to understand why it worked. Why tens of thousands of people who could barely afford to eat were spending 15 cents daily on what was essentially a lottery with terrible odds. Why they trusted street-level runners with their money. Why the system persisted for decades, despite constant police raids and periodic crackdowns. The answer isn't addiction or desperation or ignorance. The answer is that the numbers racket solved problems the legitimate financial system created. Problem 1. Black people couldn't get loans. Banks in the 1920s didn't lend to black borrowers. Period. It wasn't just prejudice, it was policy. Formal, documented, institutionalized policy. The National Banking Act had no explicit racial restrictions, but banking was locally controlled, and local banks had complete discretion over who qualified for credit. In practice, that meant black applications were denied regardless of income, employment, or creditworthiness. A black doctor making $5,000 annually couldn't get a business loan. A black property owner with clear title couldn't get a mortgage for a second building. The entire formal credit system was closed. So when Sarah Johnson needed $50 to pay for her son's medical treatment, she couldn't go to a bank. She went to her numbers runner. Who knew someone who had cash on hand and would lend it at interest rates that were high, but not predatory, with repayment terms that were informal, but enforced. That's not crime. That's alternative banking, created by necessity because the legitimate system refused to function. Problem 2. Black people couldn't save safely. They could open accounts at black-owned banks, and many did. But black banks in the 1920s were small, undercapitalized, vulnerable to runs. The Binga State Bank in Chicago collapsed in 1930, taking the savings of thousands of black depositors with it. The Dunbar National Bank in Harlem went under in 1938. People learned that putting money in official banks meant risking everything. But giving money to your numbers runner? That money was moving, circulating, accessible. You could always get it back because it was embedded in a social network, not a bureaucratic institution. Your runner knew where you lived. You knew where he lived. Trust was personal, not institutional, and personal trust in a community where institutional trust had been repeatedly betrayed was worth the risk. Problem 3. Black people couldn't invest. The stock market was functionally closed to black investors. Not legally, but practically. You needed a broker. Brokers worked for firms. Firms had policies. Those policies excluded black clients. Same with real estate outside Harlem. Same with business partnerships. Same with municipal bonds. Every legitimate investment vehicle was either explicitly or implicitly segregated. So when someone in Harlem had $500 they wanted to grow, there was nowhere to put it except back into the informal economy. Lend it to someone starting a business. Invest in a numbers operation. Buy a piece of a speakeasy. The shadow economy wasn't just where money was made, it was where money could be used. The numbers racket solved all three problems simultaneously. It provided credit, liquidity, and investment opportunities in a community excluded from all three through legitimate channels, and it did so with remarkable efficiency. Here's how it actually worked, in detail, because the mechanics matter. Every morning, runners would start their routes. Most of them worked specific territories, a few blocks, a building cluster, a section of a street. They'd visit the same people daily, people they'd built relationships with. Mrs. Johnson on the third floor always played 375. Mr. Williams at the corner store alternated between his birthday digits and his house number. The maid who worked downtown played her employer's address digits because she figured rich people had lucky numbers. Everyone had their system. Everyone had their reasons. Most played the same numbers for weeks or months, building patterns. The runner would collect bets throughout the morning. Each bet got a handwritten slip. The original went to the bettor. A carbon copy stayed with the runner. By noon, the runner would meet their controller, the next level up in the hierarchy. The controller would aggregate slips from 5 or 6 runners, verify the totals, collect the money. By 2 p.m., everything went to the bank, the operations headquarters. Usually an apartment that looked ordinary from outside, but contained adding machines, ledgers, safes, and several people whose only job was counting money and recording bets. The winning number came from the New York Clearing House's daily report of financial transactions, published in afternoon newspapers. The last 3 digits of the total handle at the track, or the last 3 digits of the Federal Reserve transactions, or the last 3 of the stock exchange totals. The exact method varied by operation, but it was always based on something public, verifiable, impossible to manipulate. This was crucial. The winning number couldn't be controlled by the bank. It had to be transparently random, because the entire system depended on trust, and trust required the game to be legitimate. Illegal, but legitimate. If your number hit, you won 600 to 1. 15 cents became $90. $90 in 1927 was 2 months' rent. It was medical bills paid. It was a winter coat for your child. It was margin between survival and catastrophe. The odds of winning were roughly 1 in 1,000, so the math heavily favored the house. But the possibility was real. People won regularly enough that everyone knew someone who'd hit. And when you won, you got paid. Always. Immediately. In cash. This is what separated Harlem's numbers banks from white-run gambling operations. Payment was guaranteed. The banks had reputations to maintain. They operated in a community where reputation was everything because legal recourse didn't exist. If a numbers banker didn't pay out, word spread within hours. Bettors would switch to competitors. Runners would quit. The entire operation would collapse. So they paid. Every time. Even when it hurt. Even when someone hit big. Especially when someone hit big, because that's what built trust. Casper Holstein understood this better than anyone. He ran his operation with principles that sound absurd for an illegal gambling enterprise, but made perfect sense if you understood the economics. First, pay winners immediately, in full, with a smile. Second, pay runners fairly and on time. Third, never expand faster than you can maintain quality control. Fourth, never skim more than the expected house edge. Fifth, invest profits back into the community visibly. That last one was key. Holstein didn't just take money out of Harlem. He circulated it. He sponsored the Harlem Renaissance Cultural Awards, giving cash prizes to poets, writers, and artists. He funded scholarships for black students. He bought buildings and rented them to black families at fair rates. He donated to the NAACP, to churches, to community organizations. He made sure everyone knew where the money came from. Numbers, profits, supporting black excellence. This created a legitimacy loop that the official system couldn't break. People played the numbers. Some won, most lost, but everyone felt like they had a chance. The money went to numbers bankers like Holstein. Holstein paid out reliably and invested publicly in community good. The community therefore tolerated, even supported the operation, which meant more people played, which meant more money, which meant more investment, which meant more community support. It was self-reinforcing, and it was phenomenally effective at concentrating capital in a community that had no other mechanism for capital concentration. By 1928, Casper Holstein was processing an estimated $2 million annually through his operation alone. Stephanie St. Clair was running a nearly equivalent operation independently. Henry Miro controlled the West Harlem policy games. Alex Pompez ran numbers in Spanish Harlem. Each of them was generating hundreds of thousands in annual profit, and all of that money stayed in Harlem because there was nowhere else to put it. They couldn't open accounts in white banks using gambling proceeds. They couldn't invest in white businesses. They couldn't buy property outside the ghetto, so they invested in what they could control: Harlem itself. Real estate. Holstein bought apartment buildings, not just for rental income, but to control housing stock, to ensure black families couldn't be arbitrarily evicted by white landlords, to create stable housing in a neighborhood where stability was rare. St. Clair did the same. By 1930, numbers bankers collectively owned more residential property in Harlem than any official real estate company. Businesses. Numbers profits funded restaurants, nightclubs, barbershops, stores. These weren't fronts for money laundering. They were legitimate businesses that created jobs, provided services, kept money circulating locally. The Cotton Club was partially funded by numbers money. The Savoy Ballroom, Small's Paradise. These weren't just entertainment venues. They were economic anchors, places that employed hundreds and attracted thousands, generating legitimate tax revenue for the city, while being quietly supported by the shadow economy. Legal defense. This is the part most histories ignore. Numbers bankers funded some of the best criminal defense attorneys in New York. Not for themselves, though they used them when necessary. For the community. When someone in Harlem got arrested on questionable charges, there was often a lawyer who'd take the case pro bono. That lawyer was being paid, just not by the defendant. They were being paid by numbers bankers who understood that community support required community protection, that you couldn't extract wealth without providing security. This created an obligation network. The community tolerated numbers operations because numbers operations provided services the government wouldn't: credit, employment, legal defense, housing stability. It was a mutual aid society funded by gambling, a social safety net built on illegal profits. And it worked because it had to work, because there was no alternative, because every legitimate avenue for community support had been systematically closed. But here's what made it a power structure rather than just a criminal enterprise: the coordination. By 1928, the major numbers bankers weren't competing destructively. They were coordinating territorially. Holstein controlled Central Harlem. St. Clair had South Harlem. Miro had West Harlem. Pompey had Spanish Harlem. They didn't have a formal agreement. They didn't need one. They had mutual interest in stability, in preventing the kind of violent territorial wars that would invite federal intervention. So they maintained boundaries, respected territories, and occasionally cooperated on issues that affected all of them. Like police payoffs. Every numbers operation paid police for protection. Not individual cops, though that happened too. They paid at the precinct level. Monthly cash payments to desk sergeants who ensured that raids were predictable, that arrests were for show, that evidence disappeared. This wasn't corruption in the sense of individual bad cops. This was institutionalized cooperation between the official system and the shadow economy. The police got paid. The numbers operations continued. Everyone maintained the fiction that gambling was illegal while ensuring it continued profitably. The amounts were staggering. Stephanie St. Clair later testified that she paid over $30,000 annually in police protection during the late 1920s. Holstein paid similar amounts. Across all operations, numbers bankers were paying hundreds of thousands annually to police, which meant the NYPD had direct financial incentive to allow the operations to continue. They were taxing the shadow economy informally, creating a corrupt but functional relationship. This is why the surveillance photographs, why the constant documentation. The NYPD knew what was happening. Everyone knew, but they couldn't stop it without losing the revenue. And they couldn't acknowledge the revenue without admitting institutional corruption. So they watched, and documented, and waited for an opportunity to intervene that wouldn't disrupt the cash flow. That opportunity came in 1928, but not from police. From the one force neither the numbers bankers nor the corrupt cops had accounted for: white organized crime. Because while Harlem was building its parallel economy, generating millions annually, creating institutional power, the white mob was consolidating nationwide. And eventually, they looked north from their midtown operations and noticed something interesting. A massive gambling operation, generating more revenue than most of their own rackets, being run by people they'd never considered competition, in a neighborhood they'd never considered valuable. Dutch Schultz looked at Harlem in 1928 and saw easy money. A disorganized collection of black criminals running penny ante operations without real muscle, without political connections, without the sophistication to fight back. He saw what everyone in the white mob saw: an opportunity for expansion with minimal risk. Take over the numbers banks, extract the profits, cut out the black operators, and absorb several million annually into Italian mob operations. What he didn't see, what none of them saw, was that Harlem's numbers operations weren't criminal enterprises. They were governing institutions. They provided credit, employment, social services, housing, legal defense. They were embedded in every aspect of community life. They had popular support not because people loved gambling, but because numbers bankers solved problems the government created. And institutions don't fold when threatened. They fight back. But Schultz didn't know that yet. In 1928, he started making moves. Quiet ones at first, talking to police about cutting numbers operations out of protection arrangements, meeting with politicians about supporting a crackdown on black gambling, sending scouts into Harlem to assess operations, identify vulnerabilities, map territories. He was planning an invasion, and he was confident it would be bloodless because he couldn't imagine that black criminals would seriously resist organized Italian mob pressure. He was about to learn otherwise, because while he was planning, Stephanie St. Clair was planning too. And she wasn't planning surrender. She was planning war. Stephanie St. Clair kept 3 ledgers. Not 1, 3. The first was obvious, sitting on her desk where anyone who entered could see it. It contained the daily numbers: bets collected, payouts made, runners' commissions, operating expenses, basic accounting, the kind of record any business would keep. The police had raided her apartment twice and found that ledger both times. They'd confiscated it, examined it, found nothing prosecutable. Because it was deliberately incomplete. Accurate, but incomplete. The second ledger was hidden, sewn into the lining of a custom-made trunk in her bedroom. It contained the real numbers, the full operation, police payments, political contributions, loans made to community members, property purchases. The complete financial picture of an enterprise generating $700,000 annually. That ledger was never seen by anyone outside her inner circle. It was too dangerous, too complete, too clearly evidence of an organization that rivaled legitimate businesses in complexity. The third ledger was something else entirely. It wasn't numbers. It was names. People who owed her. People she owed. People who'd done favors. People she'd helped. lawyers who'd taken cases, politicians who'd voted certain ways, police who'd provided warnings, rivals who'd respected territorial boundaries, allies who'd provided muscle when needed. It was a map of obligation and reciprocity, a social network documented in careful handwriting, and it was worth more than both other ledgers combined. Because money is power only if you can convert it into influence. Otherwise, it's just numbers in a book. What made Harlem's numbers, bankers, powerful wasn't the millions they generated. It was what they did with those millions. How they transformed illegal profits into legitimate community infrastructure. How they turned cash into obligation networks. How they made themselves indispensable. St. Clair understood this instinctively. She wasn't just running a gambling operation. She was building a constituency. Every loan she made created a debtor who owed her. Every legal fee she paid created a lawyer who'd take her calls. Every political contribution created a politician who'd listen. Every community donation created public goodwill. She was systematically converting money into relationships, and relationships in a community excluded from formal power structures were the only power that mattered. This is why the numbers racket became foundational. Not because gambling is inherently powerful, but because it generated continuous cash flow that could be converted into continuous relationship building. A legitimate business generates profits quarterly or annually. Numbers operations generated profits daily, which meant daily opportunities to create obligations, demonstrate generosity, build loyalty. The velocity of money mattered as much as the quantity. Consider a typical week in St. Clair's operation in 1929. Monday through Saturday, her runners collected bets. Total weekly handle, approximately $15,000. The winning numbers hit. Payouts were made. Runners got their commission. After all expenses, her net profit for the week was about $4,000. That's $208,000 annually. That's what the first ledger showed. But the second ledger told a different story. Of that $4,000 weekly profit, $500 went to police payoffs. $300 went to political contributions through intermediaries. $400 went to her legal defense fund, money kept aside for lawyers who'd defend community members arrested on questionable charges. $600 went to real estate investments, buying properties that would later be rented to black families. $200 went to community donations, church fundraisers, scholarship funds, cultural events. $800 went back into the operation as reserves, and $1,200 she kept as personal profit. She was spending 70% of her profits on everything except herself. That's not crime. That's governance. That's taxation and redistribution. That's what governments do. Extract money from the population and convert it into services, infrastructure, and public goods. St. Clair was doing exactly that, just without legal authority. She was running a shadow government funded by voluntary taxation in the form of gambling losses. And she wasn't alone. Every major numbers banker in Harlem was doing similar calculations. Holstein's version emphasized cultural patronage. Miro's emphasized employment creation. Pompey's emphasized community protection. But all of them understood the same principle. Power requires continuous reinvestment in the community that sustains it. This created a problem for Dutch Schultz that he didn't anticipate. When he started moving on Harlem in 1929, he thought he was taking over criminal enterprises. He was actually attacking governing institutions. And governing institutions don't disappear when you arrest the leadership. They reorganize. They adapt. They fight back with resources you didn't know existed. Schultz's first move was predictable. He went to the police. Specifically, to the officers already being paid by Harlem numbers bankers. His offer was simple. I'll double what they're paying you. Stop protecting them. Start raiding them. Force them to fold or sell out. It was the standard mob playbook. Buy the protection. Eliminate the competition. Absorb the operations. What he didn't understand was that the police relationship with Harlem numbers bankers wasn't purely financial. It was also practical. The numbers operations provided community stability. They employed people who might otherwise turn to more violent crime. They resolved disputes that would otherwise require police intervention. They maintained order in a neighborhood the NYPD didn't have enough officers to patrol effectively. The police weren't just being paid off, they were outsourcing governance to an informal system that worked better than their formal one. When Schultz approached them, many police took his money, but they didn't stop protecting the numbers operations. They warned the bankers. They continued providing tip-offs before raids. They ensured evidence didn't lead to convictions. Because they'd calculated that having Harlem police itself through numbers-funded community structures was easier than actually policing it. Schultz's second move was more direct. He sent men into Harlem, Italian enforcers who'd done this before in other territories. Their instructions were simple: collect protection money from numbers runners. Anyone who refused got beaten. Anyone who resisted got worse. The implication was clear. You're working for us now, whether you like it or not. They started on the edges. Small operators, independent runners who weren't affiliated with the major banks. Some of them folded, paid up, started passing their collections to Schultz's men instead of their original controllers. This is how mob expansion usually worked. Take the weak ones first. Establish presence. Build momentum. Eventually, the strong ones fold because resistance becomes unsustainable. But in Harlem, something different happened. The independent runners who got pressured went to the major numbers bankers for protection. St. Clair's response was direct. Anyone who works with Schultz's people gets cut off from all Harlem operations, permanently. Holstein backed her. So did Miro. So did Pompez. They presented a united front because they understood what Schultz didn't. If they fractured, they all lost. If they unified, they might survive. This is when the violence started. Not random violence. Calculated violence. St. Clair employed enforcers, men whose job was protecting the operation's integrity. The most effective was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, who'd been working for her since 1928. Johnson wasn't muscle in the traditional sense. He was smart, strategic. He understood that violence in numbers operations was a tool, not an objective. You used it precisely, demonstrably, to send messages, not to win wars. When Schultz's men started intimidating runners in St. Clair's territory, Johnson responded by targeting Schultz's collectors in Midtown. Not the big ones, the small-time guys collecting policy bets from Italian shopkeepers. He didn't kill them. He beat them badly enough that they stopped working. The message was clear. You come after our operations, we come after yours. And we're not restricted to our neighborhood. This was unprecedented. Black criminals hitting white mob operations in Italian neighborhoods. It violated every unwritten rule of New York's organized crime hierarchy. But it was strategically brilliant because it changed the cost calculation. Schultz thought taking Harlem would be profitable. Johnson made it expensive. Every runner he intimidated in Midtown was money Schultz wasn't collecting. Every Italian enforcer who got hospitalized was an employee off the payroll. The economics started shifting. But Schultz had resources Harlem didn't. He had Lucky Luciano's backing. He had political connections at the highest levels. He had more men, more money, more institutional support from the broader mob structure. He could absorb losses that would break the Harlem operations. And in 1930, he escalated. His men stopped going after individual runners. They started raiding numbers banks directly, walking into apartments where operations were based, smashing adding machines, burning ledgers, taking cash, beating anyone present. These weren't robbery attempts. They were demonstrations of power. The message was, you can't defend this. Give up now, or we destroy everything. St. Clair's apartment got hit in April 1930. 6 men. They broke down the door, trashed the place, took $3,000 in cash. But they didn't find the second ledger. They didn't find the third one. And they didn't find St. Clair because she wasn't there. She'd been tipped off by a police officer she'd been paying for 3 years. An officer who'd also taken Schultz's money, but decided that long-term reliable payments from St. Clair were better than short-term promises from Schultz. This is where the obligation networks proved their value. St. Clair had spent years building relationships, making loans, paying legal fees, supporting community institutions. When Schultz came after her, she didn't just have employees to defend her. She had debtors, people who owed her in ways that couldn't be calculated in dollars. Loyalty that couldn't be bought because it was already paid for through years of reciprocity. She published an open letter in the Amsterdam News in May 1930. Not subtle, not coded. Direct. Dutch Schultz and his gangsters are attempting to steal our businesses. They think because we're colored that we'll fold. They're mistaken. We built these operations when no white banks would lend to us. When no white businesses would hire us. When no white institutions would serve us. We're not giving them up. Not to Schultz. Not to anyone. It was a declaration of war. But it was also a political move. By publishing in the Amsterdam News, she made it public. Made it a community issue rather than a criminal dispute. Now, it wasn't just St. Clair versus Schultz. It was Harlem versus white mob encroachment. And Harlem had opinions. Ministers started preaching about it. Community organizations started discussing it. The NAACP, which normally stayed away from criminal matters, started quietly acknowledging that numbers operations, whatever their legal status, were black-owned businesses being targeted by white gangsters. The framing shifted. It became about economic self-determination, about resisting white attempts to control black commerce, about refusing to surrender power that had been built without permission. This is what Schultz hadn't anticipated. He thought he was fighting criminals. He was fighting community institutions. And communities defend institutions in ways that criminals can't defend operations. By mid-1930, the conflict was a stalemate. Schultz controlled some territories. St. Clair held others. Violence was regular, but not decisive. Money was being lost on both sides. Police were being paid by everyone and therefore loyal to no one. It was expensive, bloody, and unsustainable. Something had to break. What broke wasn't the operations. What broke was the political calculus. Because while Schultz and St. Clair were fighting, media was paying attention. And media attention meant white New York was becoming aware of something they'd ignored for years. There was massive money in Harlem. Millions of dollars annually flowing through an economy they didn't control. And that recognition changed everything. Politicians started asking questions. How much revenue was being generated? Who was profiting? Why weren't these operations being properly taxed if they were going to be tolerated? The NYPD, which had been quietly protecting numbers operations for cash, suddenly faced pressure to actually enforce the law. Federal authorities started investigating money laundering. The Treasury Department got interested in unpaid taxes. The spotlight was on, and neither Schultz nor St. Clair could afford sustained public attention. Both of them relied on operating in shadows, on police looking away, on politicians not caring. Once that changed, both sides became vulnerable. By late 1930, both sides were looking for an exit. Schultz, because the fight was costing more than the potential profit. St. Clair, because federal attention was more dangerous than mob competition. But neither side wanted to surrender. Surrender meant weakness, and weakness in organized crime means everyone comes after you. So they did something remarkable. They negotiated, not directly. Through intermediaries, through the very lawyers and political fixers who'd been taking money from both sides. Through people who understood that continued war was bad for everyone's business. They created a compromise that would reshape organized crime in Harlem for the next decade. The compromise was simple: territorial division. Schultz would control policy operations in certain areas. St. Clair would maintain her numbers, banks in others. Profits would be partially shared. Police protection costs would be split. Neither side won completely. Neither side lost completely. And most importantly, both sides maintained face, because they could claim they'd defended their territory. But the real consequence was something neither side fully understood at the time. By negotiating that compromise, by sitting down and dividing territories and agreeing to coexist, they'd established something new: recognition. Schultz had implicitly acknowledged that black criminals were legitimate negotiating partners, that they controlled real economic power, that they couldn't be simply displaced or absorbed. And once that recognition existed, once the precedent was set, the entire hierarchy of organized crime in New York began to shift. Because if Harlem's numbers bankers could force a negotiated settlement with Dutch Schultz, one of the most violent mobsters in America, then they weren't street-level criminals anymore. They were something else, something the system didn't have language for. They were the black elite, people who controlled capital, exercised authority, shaped outcomes, people who governed without permission and enforced without legal authority. People who'd built a parallel power structure so robust that even white organized crime had to acknowledge it. That's how money becomes power. Not through accumulation, through conversion, through transforming profits into relationships, through building obligations that persist longer than cash, through making yourself essential to enough people that removing you would destabilize the entire community. St. Clair didn't defeat Schultz through violence. She defeated him through embeddedness, by being too integrated into Harlem's social fabric to be extracted without tearing the entire fabric apart. And she wasn't alone. By 1931, there was a full class of black power brokers in Harlem, not just numbers bankers, lawyers, newspaper editors, club owners, ministers, political fixers, people who controlled different pieces of Harlem's parallel governance structure, people who knew each other, who coordinated informally, who protected shared interests, who formed a genuine elite class that operated outside official recognition, but with undeniable authority. That's where we go next, into that elite, into how they recognized each other, how they coordinated, what they controlled, how they exercised power without holding office. Because understanding the black elite of Harlem requires understanding that power isn't always formal. Sometimes it's social, sometimes it's economic. Sometimes it's simply the ability to make things happen without anyone being able to explain exactly how you did it. Part 5 of 12. Act 3. The Black Elite emerges. First half, approximately 18 minutes. The invitation was printed on cream-colored cardstock, expensive paper, the kind that felt substantial in your hand. It read, "You are cordially invited to a private dinner at the Dark Tower." Saturday, November 14th, 1931, 8 o'clock. Formal attire required. No RSVP information. No address listed. If you needed to ask where the Dark Tower was, you weren't actually invited. The Dark Tower was Alelia Walker's apartment on 136th Street. Technically an apartment. Actually a mansion converted into a social club that existed somewhere between a private residence and a public salon. Walker had inherited her mother's hair care fortune, millions of dollars that made her the wealthiest black woman in America. She could have lived anywhere. She chose Harlem, and she chose to make her home the social center of black cultural and political life. The guest list that November night was carefully curated. Not random, not accidental. Every person present represented a different form of power in Harlem, and everyone there understood exactly why they'd been invited. Stephanie St. Clair arrived at 8:15, fashionably late, wearing a dress that cost more than most Harlem families earned in 6 months. She came alone, which was unusual. Most women arrived with escorts, but St. Clair didn't need protection or social validation. Everyone knew who she was. Everyone knew what she controlled. She could arrive alone because her presence alone commanded attention. Casper Holstein was already there, talking with Langston Hughes near the bar. Holstein in a tailored tuxedo that masked his Virgin Islands accent, but not his influence. Hughes in a more modest suit, literary success not yet translating into financial security. But they were talking as equals because in this room, money wasn't the only currency. Cultural capital mattered. Intellectual capital mattered. The ability to shape narratives mattered as much as the ability to generate revenue. At a table near the window, 3 men sat discussing something that looked serious. William T. Andrews, editor of the Amsterdam News. Hubert Delaney, one of Harlem's most successful criminal defense attorneys. And Raymond Jones, a political fixer who would later become the first black leader of Tammany Hall. They weren't friends in the traditional sense. Their interests often conflicted. But they were colleagues in the business of exercising power without formal authority. In the corner, 2 ministers were in quiet conversation. Adam Clayton Powell Sr., of Abyssinian Baptist Church, which had over 10,000 members and therefore represented 10,000 votes in municipal elections. And Frederick Cullen of Salem Methodist Episcopal Church, smaller but strategically located and politically connected. They weren't discussing theology. They were discussing a zoning proposal that would affect Harlem property values. Because ministers in Harlem weren't just spiritual leaders. They were political operators. And at the center of it all, moving between groups, introducing people, facilitating conversations, was Alelia Walker herself. She wasn't just hosting. She was orchestrating, creating connections, enabling coordination, playing the role that no one else could play because no one else had her specific combination of wealth, social standing, and strategic understanding of how power networks functioned. This is how the black elite recognized each other, not through formal membership or official position, through invitation, through presence in spaces like this, through the social signaling that happened when someone like Walker decided you belonged in the room with these particular people on this particular night. The dinner itself was elaborate, multiple courses, expensive wine, served by staff who knew to be invisible. The conversation was careful. Topics ranged from art to politics to business, but certain subjects were avoided. No one discussed specific criminal operations. No one named names regarding police payoffs. No one explicitly coordinated illegal activity, but everyone understood that coordination was happening. Just in coded language, just through implication and suggestion rather than direct statement. St. Clair mentioned, casually, that certain police officers had been reassigned to different precincts. Andrews, the newspaper editor, noted that the Amsterdam News would be running a series on police corruption in Harlem next month. Jones, the political fixer, observed that municipal elections were coming up and certain aldermen would need support. Powell commented that his congregation was concerned about property speculation and displacement. Holstein announced he was establishing a new scholarship fund for Harlem students. None of these statements were random. None were disconnected. They were information sharing, coordination disguised as casual conversation, each person providing data points that others could incorporate into their own decision-making. This is how elite networks function when they can't operate openly. Through social gatherings that look like parties but function as strategy sessions. Through conversations that sound like small talk but contain significant intelligence. And this happened regularly, not just at the Dark Tower, at the Cotton Club, though that was more mixed with white patrons, at Small's Paradise, at rent parties in Harlem apartments, at church functions, at NAACP meetings, at literary salons. The black elite of Harlem had multiple overlapping social spaces where they encountered each other, built relationships, identified shared interests, and coordinated action without ever appearing to coordinate. William T. Andrews understood this better than most. He'd taken over the Amsterdam News in 1926 when it was a struggling weekly. By 1931, it was the most influential black newspaper in America. Not because of circulation, though that was substantial, because of who read it. The Amsterdam News was the paper the black elite read. The paper that shaped how Harlem understood itself. The paper that could make or break reputations, support or undermine political candidates, frame issues as community concerns or individual problems. Andrews was 52 in 1931. He'd been a teacher, a postal worker, a small business owner before buying the newspaper. He understood that journalism in Harlem wasn't just reporting, it was power. The ability to determine what stories got told, what issues mattered, who was praised or criticized. And he used that power deliberately, strategically, to advance interests he considered important. When Stephanie St. Clair was fighting Dutch Schultz, Andrews ran stories framing it as white gangsters trying to destroy black businesses. Not technically false, but a specific framing that generated community support for St. Clair. When Casper Holstein donated to the Harlem Renaissance Awards, Andrews covered it prominently, creating public association between numbers profits and cultural excellence. When police corruption got too visible, Andrews ran exposés that created political pressure for reform. He was shaping narratives, controlling information flow, exercising editorial power that had political consequences. And he was careful. The Amsterdam News never explicitly endorsed illegal activities, never directly named criminal operators, but through strategic coverage, selective emphasis, and careful framing, Andrews made sure the community understood who was protecting them, who was exploiting them, who deserved support, and who deserved opposition. He was doing what newspapers have always done, shaping public opinion. Just in a context where public opinion affected power dynamics the government couldn't control. Hubert Delaney represented a different form of power. He was one of the few black lawyers in New York who could practice in any court, who was respected by judges, who had enough legal skill that even white clients occasionally hired him. He'd graduated from City College, passed the bar in 1918, and built a practice that was officially focused on real estate and business law, but actually focused on whatever his clients needed. Most of his clients were involved in illegal enterprises, numbers bankers, speakeasy owners, after-hours club operators, people who needed legal representation but couldn't get it from white firms. Delaney provided that representation. But more than that, he provided translation. He understood both worlds, the legal system and the shadow economy. He could explain to numbers bankers how to structure their operations to minimize legal exposure. He could explain to judges why arresting certain people would destabilize entire neighborhoods. He was a bridge between systems that officially didn't acknowledge each other. And he made money doing it. Lots of money. By 1931, Delaney was one of the wealthiest black professionals in Harlem. Not just from legal fees, though those were substantial, from investments. He took payment in cash and property. He owned buildings. He had stake in businesses. He was using his position between legitimate and illegitimate worlds to accumulate legitimate wealth. And he was demonstrating something crucial. Criminal profits could be laundered into respectability through legal expertise and strategic investment. His presence at Walker's dinner wasn't accidental. He was there because everyone in that room either used his services or might need them. St. Clair had him on retainer. Holstein consulted him on property purchases. The ministers needed his advice on church-owned real estate. The politicians needed his understanding of how to navigate legal challenges. He was essential, and everyone knew it. Raymond Jones represented yet another form of power. Political mediation. He wasn't elected to anything. He held no official position. But he understood Tammany Hall's machinery better than most people who worked for it. He understood how votes translated into political favors, how campaign contributions translated into policy decisions, how patronage networks functioned, and most importantly, he understood how to operate within that system as a black man when the system was designed to exclude black participation. Jones had started as a ward healer, doing basic political work in the 1920s, registering voters, getting people to polls, the unglamorous mechanics of democracy. But he was smart. He noticed patterns. He understood that Harlem's population was growing faster than its political representation, that black voters were concentrated enough to swing municipal elections if they voted as a bloc, that white politicians needed black votes but didn't want to acknowledge it publicly. So Jones positioned himself as the intermediary, the person white political bosses could talk to when they needed Harlem's votes, the person who could deliver those votes if the price was right. Not just money, though that was part of it. Jobs, city contracts, improved services, patronage positions. Jones traded votes for resources, and he made sure those resources went to people who reinforced his position as the indispensable middleman. By 1931, no one got elected in Harlem without Jones's approval. Not because he controlled votes directly, because he controlled the infrastructure that mobilized votes. He knew the ministers who influenced congregations. He knew the club owners who employed hundreds. He knew the numbers bankers who had relationships with thousands of bettors. He could coordinate all of them toward supporting or opposing candidates. That made him more powerful than any elected official, because elected officials came and went. But Jones's network persisted. His presence at these elite gatherings was strategic. He wasn't socializing. He was maintaining relationships, making sure everyone understood that political access required going through him. That if you wanted city contracts, zoning variances, police assignments changed, school funding allocated, you needed his coordination. He was selling a service, the ability to interface with official power structures that wouldn't directly negotiate with Black Harlem. Adam Clayton Powell Sr. represented something different still: moral authority combined with electoral power. Abyssinian Baptist Church wasn't just large, it was organized. Powell ran it like a political machine, disguised as a religious institution. Members weren't just congregants. They were a voting bloc, an employment network, a community welfare system. The church provided social services the government didn't. Job placement, financial assistance, childcare, legal aid referrals, housing support. This created profound loyalty. People didn't just attend Powell's church. They depended on it. And that dependence translated into influence. When Powell suggested congregation members vote a certain way, they generally did. When he endorsed candidates, they won. When he opposed policies, they faced organized resistance. He had 10,000 people who would show up to city council meetings if he asked. That's power. Direct, mobilizable, consequential power. But Powell was careful. He never directly aligned with criminal elements, never endorsed numbers bankers publicly, never acknowledged the shadow economy that funded much of Harlem's legitimate economy. He maintained plausible deniability, but he also didn't condemn, didn't preach against gambling, didn't refuse donations from people whose money came from questionable sources. He accepted reality. Harlem's economy was what it was. His job was to channel resources toward community benefit, not to judge where resources came from. His relationship with people like St. Clair and Holstein was cordial but distant. They respected his position. He acknowledged their community contributions. When Holstein funded scholarships, Powell publicly praised him. When St. Clair got arrested, Powell's church members showed up to court as character witnesses. There was mutual support without explicit coordination, understanding without acknowledgement. This is how legitimate and illegitimate power structures coexisted in Harlem, through careful maintenance of boundaries that everyone tacitly agreed not to cross. The dinner at the Dark Tower lasted until nearly midnight. By the end, several things had been accomplished, without anything explicit being decided. Andrews had gathered information for future stories. Delaney had made mental notes about legal strategies several people might need. Jones had assessed political alignments for upcoming elections. Powell had secured commitments for church fundraising. Holstein had identified new cultural projects to fund. St. Clair had reinforced her social standing among people who mattered. And Alelia Walker had achieved her objective, maintaining the social infrastructure that allowed Harlem's elite to function as a collective without ever formalizing that collective. Because the moment you formalize, you create vulnerability. Written agreements can be discovered. Organizations can be investigated. But social networks, dinner parties, cultural salons, those are just people spending time together. Nothing illegal about that. Nothing prosecutable. Just wealthy and influential Black people socializing. And through that, socializing, governing. This is what most histories of Harlem miss. They focus on individual figures. Stephanie St. Clair, the numbers queen. Casper Holstein, the banker. Bumpy Johnson, the enforcer. But those individuals operated within a network, a social infrastructure that connected different forms of power: economic, political, legal, moral, cultural. And that network functioned through spaces like the Dark Tower, through newspapers like the Amsterdam News, through churches like Abyssinian Baptist, through law offices like Delaney's, through backroom political negotiations like Jones facilitated. The Black elite of Harlem wasn't a conspiracy, wasn't a formal organization. It was a social class that emerged because conditions required it. Because when formal power structures exclude you, informal power structures develop. Because when you can't operate through official channels, you build unofficial ones. Because when the system denies you authority, you create parallel authority that functions just as effectively, even if it's never officially acknowledged. By 1932, this parallel authority was undeniable. You could map it. You could document it. The NYPD certainly tried. Their surveillance files from the early 1930s contain hundreds of photographs. thousands of reports, detailed documentation of who met with whom, where, when. They were trying to understand the structure, trying to find the hierarchy, trying to identify the leader they could arrest to collapse the whole system. But there was no leader, no hierarchy in the traditional sense. There were multiple power centers that balanced each other through competition and cooperation. Remove one, and the others adjusted. It was decentralized authority, networked governance, and it was remarkably stable precisely because it wasn't centralized. This is what made it threatening. Not crime, not violence, not even the millions of dollars flowing through shadow economy. What made it threatening was that it proved black people could govern themselves, could build institutions, could exercise authority, could create order without permission from white power structures. And if that was possible in Harlem, it was theoretically possible anywhere. Which meant the entire justification for exclusion was false. That realization, that possibility, was more dangerous than any criminal operation, because criminal operations could be shut down. But proof of capability? That persisted. That changed how people understood what was possible. That created precedent. And precedent, once established, is almost impossible to erase. The black elite of Harlem had established precedent. They'd proven that parallel power structures were viable, that excluded populations could organize effective governance. That authority didn't require official recognition to function, and that precedent would last decades beyond the specific individuals who created it. Because the idea, once demonstrated, couldn't be undone. You couldn't make people forget that it had worked. That for a while, in one neighborhood, black people had governed themselves without asking permission, and it had functioned better than many legitimate governments. That's the legacy of Harlem's elite. Not the money they made, not the political influence they wielded, not even the cultural renaissance they funded. The legacy was the demonstration, the proof of concept, the evidence that was impossible to ignore, even when people wanted to ignore it. But that legacy came with a cost, because parallel power structures are inherently unstable. They exist in the gaps between official systems, and when official systems decide to close those gaps, parallel structures collapse. The question was never whether Harlem's elite would last forever. The question was how long they could maintain power without formal authority, how much they could accomplish in that time, and what would happen when the official system finally decided to intervene decisively. That intervention was coming. Not yet. Not in 1932. But the pressures were building. Federal attention was increasing. Media scrutiny was intensifying. And most dangerously, success was attracting attention from people who wanted to take what had been built. The Italian mob had backed off temporarily, but they hadn't given up. They were watching, waiting, planning, looking for weakness, for opportunity, for the moment when Harlem's elite made a mistake that would allow white organized crime to finally take what they'd wanted all along. The envelope arrived at Hubert Delaney's office on a Tuesday morning in March 1933. No return address. Hand-delivered by someone who didn't wait for a signature. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 pieces of information: a name, a date, and an address. Nothing else. No explanation, no context, just data. The name was Marcus Thompson. The date was March 18th. The address was a location in the Bronx where the NYPD 41st Precinct conducted interrogations. Delaney looked at the information for exactly 3 seconds before picking up his phone. He made 4 calls. The first to Raymond Jones, the political fixer. The second to William Andrews at the Amsterdam News. The third to a bail bondsman he'd worked with for years. The fourth to Stephanie St. Clair. Each call lasted less than 2 minutes. He didn't explain everything, didn't need to, just provided specific information to specific people who knew what to do with it. By Wednesday afternoon, Marcus Thompson, who'd been arrested on suspicion of running numbers in the Bronx, was released. No charges filed. The evidence had disappeared. The arresting officers suddenly couldn't remember details. A judge had made a phone call, and Thompson walked out of the precinct, confused but free, with Delaney waiting outside to drive him back to Harlem. Thompson never knew who sent that envelope, never knew which police officer tipped off Delaney about his arrest before it was processed, never knew which politician called which judge, never knew which newspaper editor threatened which police captain with an expose if this arrest proceeded. He just knew that the system, which usually crushed people like him, had somehow worked in his favor this time. That's how the network functioned operationally. Not through formal organization, through distributed response. Someone in the police department saw an arrest that would affect Harlem's interests. They anonymously warned someone in the legal community. That person activated appropriate resources, political pressure, media threat, legal intervention, bail coordination, and the system, which looked impenetrable from outside, suddenly developed flexibility for people connected to the right network. This happened dozens of times annually. Not for everyone, not for random arrests, but for people who mattered to the network's interests. Numbers runners who worked for protected operations, business owners who paid the right tributes, community members who had connections through churches, clubs, or family relationships. The network didn't save everyone, but it saved enough people that everyone in Harlem understood there was a difference between being connected and being alone. And connection wasn't just about knowing the right people. It was about being valuable to the right people, contributing to the ecosystem, following the unwritten rules that maintained collective security. The network protected its members, but membership required something in return: information, loyalty, discretion, and most importantly, understanding that individual actions affected collective interests. When someone violated those rules, the network responded, not dramatically, not publicly, just quietly, effectively, permanently. In 1932, a nightclub owner named James Peterson started cooperating with federal investigators. He wasn't formally arrested or charged. He just started talking, providing information about who owned what, who paid whom, how money moved through Harlem's economy. He thought he was being careful, thought he could inform without being detected. Within a week, his suppliers stopped delivering liquor. His best employees quit without explanation. His police protection evaporated. Health inspectors suddenly found violations. Fire marshals found code issues. Within a month, his club was closed. Within 2 months, he'd left Harlem. Not because anyone threatened him, because the network simply stopped functioning for him. Every relationship dissolved simultaneously. Every connection broke. He became invisible to the system that had previously sustained him. No one explicitly ordered this. No one coordinated it formally, but everyone understood. Peterson had violated the fundamental rule: you don't expose the network to outside authority. You don't help the official system understand how the parallel system functions. Once you do that, you become a threat to everyone, and threats get isolated, expelled, removed from the ecosystem. This is why the network was stable. Not through violence, though violence existed as backup. Through mutual dependence. Everyone benefited from the system's continued functioning. Numbers bankers needed political protection. Politicians needed financial support. Newspapers needed information access. Lawyers needed clients. Ministers needed community resources. Club owners needed police tolerance. Each person or group controlled a piece of the infrastructure. Remove any piece, and the system became less functional for everyone. So they protected each other. Not altruistically, pragmatically, because individual survival depended on collective stability. This is what distinguished Harlem's elite from traditional criminal organizations. The mafia had hierarchy: bosses, capos, soldiers, a clear command structure where orders flowed downward and money flowed upward. But Harlem's elite network was horizontal. Different power centers of roughly equal strength, coordinating through negotiation rather than command, maintaining balance through mutual interest rather than subordination. Take the relationship between Stephanie St. Clair and Adam Clayton Powell Sr. They operated in completely different spheres. She ran numbers. He ran a church. Their activities never directly intersected, but they had aligned interests. St. Clair needed moral legitimacy. Powell needed financial resources for community programs, so St. Clair donated to church programs. Not directly to Powell, that would be too obvious, but to specific initiatives, youth programs, food banks, elder care, donations that were publicly announced and praised. Powell accepted those donations and acknowledged St. Clair's community contributions, without ever discussing where her money came from. In return, when St. Clair faced legal troubles, Powell's congregation showed up, not at his direction, officially, just through word of mouth, through the informal communication networks that churches excel at maintaining. Suddenly, 50 respectable church members would be in the courtroom, providing visual evidence of community support. Character witnesses would emerge. Letters would be written to judges. Powell never explicitly coordinated this. He just made sure his congregation understood that St. Clair was a valued community member and left the implications unspoken. This was mutually beneficial exchange without explicit transaction. Neither person commanded the other. Neither could compel the other's cooperation. But both understood that maintaining good relations served their interests. So they maintained those relations carefully, publicly, with enough distance that no one could prove coordination, but enough connection that benefits flowed both directions. Multiply this dynamic across dozens of relationships, and you begin to understand how the network functioned. Casper Holstein and Langston Hughes. Holstein funded Hughes's poetry, and Hughes provided cultural legitimacy to Holstein's money. Raymond Jones and various city council members. Jones delivered votes, and councilmen delivered zoning variances. William Andrews and multiple politicians. Andrews provided favorable coverage, and politicians provided information access. Hubert Delaney and everyone. Delaney provided legal services, and everyone provided clients, information, and protection for his legitimate business interests. Each relationship was individually logical. Each exchange was mutually beneficial. But aggregated together, these relationships created a network that was greater than the sum of its parts. A network that could solve problems no individual could solve. Coordinate actions no organization could coordinate. Exercise power no official structure could wield. Consider a specific example: the 1933 zoning dispute. The city announced plans to rezone part of central Harlem for industrial development. On the surface, this was a municipal planning decision, legitimate government authority allocating land use. But the real impact would be displacement of black residents, reduction of available housing stock, and demolition of buildings owned by numbers bankers who'd been using real estate as capital storage. The elite network responded on multiple fronts simultaneously. Powell mobilized his congregation. Suddenly, 500 people showed up at a city council meeting, flooding the room, demanding to speak, turning a routine planning session into a political event. Andrews ran stories in the Amsterdam News, framing the rezoning as racist urban policy designed to shrink Black Harlem. The stories included specific details about which councilmen supported it, which developers stood to profit, which banks had provided financing. Details that made it clear someone with inside information was feeding the newspaper. Jones worked the political machinery from inside. He identified which councilmen had close electoral margins. He calculated how many votes opposition to the rezoning would cost them. He made sure those councilmen understood the political calculus. Not through threats, through information. Just sharing data about their district's demographics, voting patterns, the percentage of their constituents who would be affected. Letting them draw their own conclusions about what supporting this rezoning would cost them. Delaney filed legal challenges, procedural objections, environmental concerns, historical preservation claims. Each challenge was legally defensible, but transparently designed to delay rather than to win. But delay was the point. Delay meant media attention. Delay meant political pressure could build. Delay meant councilmen who initially supported the plan could find reasons to change their minds without looking like they were surrendering to pressure. And behind all of this, quietly, numbers money paid for everything. Paid the legal fees for the challenges, paid for the leaflets Powell's congregation distributed, paid for expanded newspaper coverage in the Amsterdam News, paid for community organizers who coordinated the neighborhood response. None of this money was traceable. None of it appeared in campaign finance records or legal filings. But everyone involved knew where resources came from, knew that the shadow economy was funding the legitimate political resistance. The rezoning proposal died in committee, not because any single tactic defeated it, because the combined pressure from multiple directions made supporting it politically unsustainable. Councilmen faced organized opposition from churches, negative press coverage, legal complications, and electoral consequences. It was easier to kill the proposal than to fight on all those fronts simultaneously. So they killed it. And everyone in Harlem's elite network understood what had happened. They'd coordinated effectively enough to defeat municipal government policy. That's power. Not power over people. Power over systems. The ability to interface with official governance structures and alter their outcomes. And the ability to do so without any official authority. Without anyone being able to identify exactly who made the decision or how coordination occurred. Because there was no single decision. No formal coordination. Just distributed response from multiple actors with aligned interests. This is what surveillance photographs couldn't capture, what police reports couldn't document, what federal investigators couldn't understand. They saw meetings. They recorded conversations. They tracked money flows. But they couldn't perceive the network structure because the network didn't exist as a formal entity. It existed as relationships, as mutual understanding, as tacit coordination between people who'd learned to read signals and respond appropriately without explicit communication. By 1934, the network was sophisticated enough to handle increasingly complex problems. When the Depression hit Harlem harder than it hit white neighborhoods, the elite network responded with coordinated crisis management. Numbers bankers increased payouts to make betting more attractive. Clubs extended credit to patrons who couldn't pay immediately. Churches expanded food programs. Political fixers secured federal relief funds for Harlem projects. Lawyers provided free legal services for eviction defense. Each person or organization doing what they could within their domain. No one coordinating the entire response, but everyone responding in ways that reinforced others' efforts. The result was that Harlem's informal safety net functioned better than official depression relief programs in many cases. Federal programs had application processes, eligibility requirements, bureaucratic delays. The network had relationships. You knew someone who could help. You went to them. Help arrived. Not always. Not for everyone. But fast enough and frequently enough that people trusted the informal system more than the formal one. This created legitimacy. Not legal legitimacy. Social legitimacy. The perception that the network served community interests even when it operated outside legal frameworks. And social legitimacy is ultimately more durable than legal authority. Legal authority requires enforcement. Social legitimacy requires only continued effectiveness. As long as the network kept solving problems the official system created or ignored, people supported it. Even people who didn't directly benefit. Even people who technically disapproved of criminal enterprise. Because the network wasn't just crime. It was community infrastructure. But that infrastructure had vulnerabilities. The most significant was visibility. The more effective the network became, the more attention it attracted. And attention meant pressure. From the federal government, which was increasingly interested in organized crime. From reform politicians, who saw corruption everywhere and wanted to clean it up. From media outside Harlem, which could paint the network as criminal conspiracy rather than community governance. From white organized crime, which still wanted control of Harlem's economy. And most dangerously, from within Harlem itself, from people who resented the elite's power and wanted to challenge it. The network's strength was its decentralization. But decentralization also meant no one could speak for the whole. No one could negotiate on behalf of everyone. No one could make binding decisions that everyone would follow. When external pressure increased, the network's response was distributed, sometimes contradictory, occasionally counterproductive. Some members advocated accommodation with white power structures. Others insisted on resistance. Some wanted to legitimize operations through political cooperation. Others preferred to stay in the shadows. These tensions existed from the beginning, but as long as external pressure was manageable, Internal disagreements didn't matter. When pressure intensified, disagreements became fractures. And pressure was intensifying. By 1935, the federal government was building the legal and institutional infrastructure that would eventually be used against organized crime nationwide. Prohibition was over, but the enforcement apparatus remained. The FBI was expanding. The Treasury Department was developing new tools for prosecuting tax evasion. Congressional committees were investigating racketeering. None of this was specifically targeted at Harlem, but all of it created mechanisms that could be used against any parallel economic structure once authorities decided to focus on it. More immediately, the Italian mob was regrouping. The temporary accommodation with Dutch Schultz hadn't satisfied them. They'd paused, reassessed, and concluded that Harlem was too valuable to leave in black hands. But they'd learned from Schultz's mistakes. They understood that direct assault wouldn't work. They needed different tactics. Infiltration rather than invasion. Cooperation initially, then gradual takeover. They needed to get inside the network before they could dismantle it. And they had an advantage. The network's greatest strength was also its vulnerability. It was based on relationships, on trust, on mutual benefit, all of which could be manipulated by people skilled at manipulation. The mafia had been corrupting politicians, buying police, and infiltrating businesses for decades. They were expert at identifying leverage points, finding the person whose loyalty was purchasable, the relationship that could be broken, the mutual benefit that could be redirected. They started probing carefully, offering partnerships rather than demanding submission, suggesting profit-sharing arrangements that seemed fair, identifying individuals in the network who were ambitious but constrained, who saw the elite structure as limiting their potential, who might be willing to cooperate with outsiders if it meant advancing personally. They were looking for fractures. And in any network, fractures exist. The question is whether external pressure opens them wider, or whether the network repairs them before catastrophic failure. Harlem's elite network faced that test between 1935 and 1940. It's the test every parallel power structure eventually faces. Can you maintain cohesion when the official system decides to dismantle you? Can informal agreements survive formal pressure? Can social legitimacy withstand legal assault? Can relationships persist when individuals face the choice between collective interest and personal survival? The answers to those questions would determine whether the black elite of Harlem persisted or collapsed, whether the parallel power structure they'd built could survive the next phase, whether governance without permission could endure once those with permission decided it couldn't be tolerated anymore. But before we get to that collapse, to that eventual failure, we need to understand one more crucial element of how the network functioned. The element most people misunderstand. The element that gets sensationalized in popular histories, but actually functioned as a sophisticated tool within a complex system. We need to understand crime itself, not as an identity, not as a moral failing, but as an instrument of power, as a negotiating position, as leverage that could be deployed, threatened, or withheld depending on strategic calculations. Because the black elite of Harlem didn't just commit crimes. They weaponized crime, turned illegality into a political tool, used the threat of disorder to maintain order, and understood that violence, when used precisely and sparingly, could sometimes prevent more violence than it caused. That's where we go next, into the mechanics of enforcement, the calculations behind violence, the way crime functioned as currency in negotiations with power structures that only respected force. Because understanding Harlem's elite requires understanding that they weren't just criminals who happened to gain power. They were power brokers who happened to use crime as one tool among many, and they used it with more sophistication than most people who study them have recognized. Bumpy Johnson carried a gun for 11 years before he fired it at another person. 11 years. That's not an accident. That's not luck. That's strategy. The gun wasn't for shooting. It was for showing, for creating calculation in other people's minds, for making them weigh whether whatever they were considering was worth the risk of finding out if he'd actually use it. He carried a .38 special, nickel-plated, visible in a shoulder holster under a deliberately loose jacket. Visible was the point. If people saw the gun, they factored it into their decision-making. They chose differently. They backed down from confrontations they might otherwise have escalated. The gun prevented violence by threatening violence. And for 11 years, that threat was sufficient. Until 1935, when it wasn't. The man's name was Irving Wexler, though everyone called him Waxy Gordon. He was a bootlegger, a narcotics trafficker, a professional criminal who'd worked with Arnold Rothstein and Meyer Lansky. He was in Harlem on behalf of Dutch Schultz, trying to intimidate a numbers runner named Thomas into switching operations. Schultz's usual approach: you work for us now, or you don't work at all. Thomas was connected to Stephanie St. Clair's operation. When Gordon approached him, Thomas refused. Gordon escalated. He beat Thomas badly enough that Thomas spent 3 days in the hospital. This wasn't negotiation. This was demonstration. The message was clear. Resistance has consequences. St. Clair sent Johnson to respond. Not to negotiate. Not to threaten. To respond. Johnson found Gordon in a bar on 145th Street. He walked in, sat down 2 stools away, ordered a drink, and didn't say anything for 5 minutes. Just sat there. Gordon knew who he was. Everyone knew who Bumpy Johnson was. The silence was deliberate, creating space for Gordon to make a choice. Gordon made the wrong choice. He stood up, started walking toward the door, and said something disparaging as he passed. Not loud, not aggressive, just dismissive. The kind of comment designed to assert dominance, to show he wasn't intimidated. Johnson stood up, walked after him, and shot him in the leg. One shot, not center mass, not lethal, disabling. Gordon went down, screaming. Johnson put the gun away, walked out, and disappeared into Harlem before police arrived. Gordon survived. He also left Harlem and never returned. The lesson wasn't that Bumpy Johnson would kill you. The lesson was that he would respond, proportionally, but inevitably, to violations of established boundaries. And everyone else in the white mob saw it too. Saw that their enforcers could be touched, that Harlem wasn't passive territory, that escalation would be met with escalation. Johnson was arrested 3 days later. St. Clair had Hubert Delaney represent him. The case was complicated. There were witnesses. Gordon identified Johnson. The gun was recovered. But the prosecution had problems. Gordon couldn't explain what he'd been doing in Harlem. He was a known criminal with no legitimate reason to be in that neighborhood. Thomas wouldn't testify, claimed he didn't remember who assaulted him. Other witnesses developed memory problems. The evidence chain had irregularities. After 4 months, charges were reduced to illegal weapons possession. Johnson pleaded guilty, paid a fine, walked out. This is how violence functioned in Harlem's power structure. Not randomly, not frequently. Precisely, demonstratively, with clear messages encoded in every action. Johnson didn't shoot Gordon to kill him. He shot him to communicate, to establish that boundaries existed and would be enforced, to create deterrence effect that would prevent future violations. The violence itself was secondary to the message the violence sent, and the network supported that message. Delaney provided legal defense. St. Clair provided bail and financial support. The Amsterdam News ran a story framing the incident as self-defense against white mob aggression. Raymond Jones made sure the assistant district attorney handling the case understood there were political consequences to pursuing it too aggressively. Adam Clayton Powell's congregation contributed to Johnson's legal defense fund. The network mobilized to protect someone who'd used violence in service of collective interests. This is the part most people misunderstand about crime in Harlem's elite structure. They think it was chaos, random violence by people who didn't know better. But violence in this context was tool deployment, strategic, calculated. Used sparingly because overuse diminished its effectiveness. The threat of violence was more useful than violence itself. Once you actually used it, you'd expended a resource. The art was making people believe you'd use it without having to use it most of the time. Stephanie St. Clair understood this better than almost anyone. She built her reputation on being willing to use violence while rarely actually using it. Her organization employed enforcers, men whose job was intimidation and occasional physical correction. But the ratio of threats to actions was probably 100 to 1. Most confrontations ended with conversation, with negotiation, with establishing that resistance would be costly and cooperation would be profitable. Violence was the option when other options failed, but when she did use violence, it was memorable. In 1931, a rival numbers banker named Wilfred Brunder tried to poach her runners, started offering them better commission rates, trying to build his operation at her expense. St. Clair warned him once, sent a message through intermediaries, respect territorial boundaries, or face consequences. Brunder ignored the warning. He thought she was bluffing, thought a woman wouldn't actually retaliate. She had 3 of his collection points hit simultaneously, not robbed, destroyed. Her people walked in, smashed adding machines, burned ledgers, took all the cash, and beat everyone present badly enough that they needed medical attention. It was systematic, coordinated, decisive, and it wasn't just about Brunder. It was about everyone else watching. The message was, boundaries are real, warnings are genuine, violations will be punished. Brunder shut down his operation within a week, left Harlem entirely, and for the next 3 years, no one else tried to poach St. Clair's runners. The violence had been expensive. 3 enforcers' time, bail money for the arrests that followed, legal fees, the risk of attracting police attention. But it had created years of deterrent effect. It was an investment in future stability. That's how professionals think about violence. Not as rage or revenge, but as cost-benefit calculation. This approach required discipline. Most people who carry guns eventually use them inappropriately. They get angry, they get scared, they make emotional decisions. But the enforcers in Harlem's elite network were selected for temperament as much as capability. Johnson was smart, patient, controlled. So was Freddie Moore, who worked for Casper Holstein. So was Junie Bird, who provided security for multiple operations. These weren't angry men looking for fights. They were professionals managing risk. They got paid well. Johnson made more annually than most lawyers in Harlem. Moore owned property, drove expensive cars, dressed like a businessman. This wasn't compensation for violence. It was compensation for restraint, for the discipline to use violence only when necessary, for the judgment to distinguish between situations that required force and situations that required other responses. You don't pay street thugs those salaries. You pay sophisticated operators who understand that their real job is preventing violence through credible threat. And they worked within rules. Unwritten but clearly understood rules that everyone in the network followed. You didn't kill without authorization from whoever you worked for. You didn't target civilians. You didn't create situations that would force police to respond aggressively. You didn't generate newspaper headlines that would force politicians to crack down. Violence had to be contained, controlled, deployed, only when strategic benefit exceeded risk. These rules weren't altruistic. They were pragmatic. Excessive violence attracted attention. Attention attracted federal intervention. Federal intervention threatened everyone's operations. So, violence was collectively regulated, even though no formal regulatory structure existed. Violate the rules, and you found yourself isolated. Other operators wouldn't work with you. The network stopped providing protection. You became vulnerable. And in an environment where everyone had enemies, vulnerability was eventually fatal. Consider what happened to Vincent Call, an Irish gangster who tried to establish himself in Harlem in 1931. He was violent, unpredictable, willing to kill witnesses, willing to target civilians. His approach was chaos, maximum intimidation through maximum brutality. In his world, the most feared person won, and he was genuinely feared, but he didn't understand Harlem's ecosystem. When he started operating in Harlem, kidnapping numbers bankers for ransom, killing people who resisted, creating media spectacles, the network responded, not with matching violence, with isolation. They stopped doing business in areas where Call operated. They warned community members to avoid his operations. They provided information to police about his locations. They made sure that operating in Harlem became unprofitable for him. No money flowing through his operations meant no reason to stay. Call tried to adapt, increased violence to force compliance, kidnapped Casper Holstein, and demanded $50,000 ransom. Holstein paid it, but while Call was collecting ransom, the network was coordinating. Raymond Jones was providing police with information about Call's locations. The Amsterdam News was running stories about violence terrorizing the community. Ministers were demanding police action. Lawyers were filing complaints. And Bumpy Johnson was tracking Call's movements. Calibrated analytical framing of systemic power dynamics. I need to be careful here. I'm describing violence and crime, but I need to maintain the analytical tone. This isn't glorification. It's explaining how violence functioned as a tool within a power structure. The key is showing the calculation, the restraint, the strategic thinking that differentiated elite operators from random criminals. I should continue showing how crime was weaponized as leverage, how it functioned in negotiations, and how the elite used the threat of disorder to maintain order. This needs to build toward showing that crime wasn't their identity. It was one instrument among many. Call was killed in February 1932, shot in a phone booth by persons unknown. Dutch Schultz was credited with the hit, but people in Harlem knew better. The information that put Call in that phone booth at that moment came from Harlem. The network had decided he was too destabilizing, too unpredictable, too threatening to collective interests, so they'd made him locatable. And once locatable, people with grudges handled the rest. This is elite crime, not street violence, strategic elimination of threats to systemic stability. The network didn't do the killing. They just ensured conditions existed where someone else would. Plausible deniability. No direct connection, but effective outcome. That's sophistication. That's understanding how to use violence without being vulnerable to prosecution for violence. But crime wasn't just enforcement. It was also currency. Leverage in negotiations with power structures that only understood force. When the black elite needed something from politicians or police or judges, they couldn't offer campaign contributions in the traditional sense. Their money was illegal. But they could offer other things. Information about criminal activity. Cooperation with investigations. Reduction in violence. Or conversely, they could threaten to withhold those things. To let crime increase. To make neighborhoods ungovernable. To create problems that officials would be blamed for. This is how the 1934 police funding negotiation worked. The NYPD wanted to increase the Harlem precinct budget. More officers, more equipment, more presence. The city council was resistant. Budget constraints from the Depression. The precinct captain needed political support to get the funding approved. He reached out to Raymond Jones, who consulted with the network. The network's response was calculated. They'd support police funding expansion if the additional officers weren't used to target numbers operations, if protection arrangements continued, if the expansion was focused on violent crime rather than gambling enforcement. The precinct captain agreed. Jones mobilized community support. Suddenly, ministers were preaching about the need for better policing. The Amsterdam News ran editorials supporting the budget increase. Community meetings featured testimony about crime concerns. The funding was approved. The network had helped expand police presence in Harlem, which sounds counterintuitive until you understand the calculation. More police meant more stable neighborhoods. Stability meant better business environment for everyone. And the network had negotiated terms that protected their operations while supporting legitimate community interests. They'd used their political influence to shape police policy in ways that served both legitimate and illegitimate interests simultaneously. This is crime as negotiating position. You control enough illegal activity that authorities need your cooperation to reduce it. But you maintain enough legitimacy that you can publicly support law enforcement without appearing hypocritical. You become indispensable to both systems. The illegal economy needs you to manage relations with authorities. The authorities need you to maintain community stability. And you're valuable to both sides precisely because you operate in the space between them. Hubert Delaney played this game brilliantly in the legal system. He represented criminals, which gave him detailed knowledge of criminal operations. But he also maintained relationships with prosecutors, which gave him knowledge of their priorities and strategies. He could tell numbers bankers what prosecutors cared about and what they ignored. He could tell prosecutors which investigations would yield results and which would waste resources. He was information broker between systems that officially didn't acknowledge each other, but practically had to coordinate. And he got paid by both sides. Criminals paid legal fees. Prosecutors used him as unofficial source for information about criminal activities they weren't prioritizing. Everyone benefited from his intermediary position. He was too useful to prosecute, too embedded to eliminate, too connected to ignore. That's how you turn crime into sustainable power, by making yourself necessary to everyone. But this approach required constant calibration. Push too hard, and authorities felt compelled to crack down. Back off too much, and competitors moved in. The network had to maintain precise balance. Enough crime to demonstrate power. Not so much that intervention became inevitable. Enough cooperation with authorities to seem reasonable. Not so much that community support eroded. It was tightrope walking, maintaining equilibrium between multiple conflicting pressures. By 1935, that equilibrium was becoming harder to maintain. The federal government was getting more sophisticated at prosecuting organized crime. The Treasury Department had successfully prosecuted Al Capone for tax evasion in 1931, establishing precedent for going after criminal enterprises through financial crimes rather than direct criminal activity. That precedent threatened everyone in the shadow economy, because financial records existed even when criminal evidence didn't. The Harlem Network's response was to further decentralize money flows. Instead of large centralized numbers banks, operations fragmented into smaller units. Instead of direct payments, money moved through intermediaries. Instead of bank accounts, cash stayed physical. They were adapting to increased scrutiny by becoming harder to trace. But adaptation had costs. Decentralization reduced efficiency. Fragmentation created coordination problems. The network was becoming less effective at the precise moment it needed to be most effective. And the Italian mob was watching. They saw the pressure. They saw the adaptation. They saw the vulnerability. And they saw opportunity. Because while Harlem's elite was dealing with federal attention, Dutch Schultz and Lucky Luciano were building something different. A new kind of organized crime structure that was more centralized, more hierarchical, more capable of sustaining pressure. They were learning from Harlem's example, but building something that could scale nationally in ways Harlem's network couldn't. The fundamental problem was that Harlem's network was based on social relationships, on trust, on local knowledge, all of which worked perfectly in Harlem, but didn't translate to other locations. You couldn't export it, couldn't franchise it, couldn't scale it beyond the specific community where relationships existed. The Italian mob's hierarchical structure could scale. You could establish branches in different cities with clear reporting lines and centralized control. Harlem's horizontal network couldn't do that. So Harlem's elite had built something remarkable, but inherently limited. A governance structure that worked brilliantly in one neighborhood, but couldn't expand beyond it. And that limitation meant that when confronted by organizations that could scale nationally, they'd always be at disadvantage in the long term. They could defend their territory, they could maintain their operations, but they couldn't grow beyond Harlem's boundaries. And in organized crime, inability to grow eventually means decline. But in 1935, that decline wasn't inevitable yet. It was possible, foreseeable, but not certain. The network was still strong. The elite was still united. The community support was still solid. They'd successfully fought off initial mob encroachment. They'd adapted to increased federal scrutiny. They'd maintained power through depression. They were resilient, sophisticated, capable. The question was whether that would be enough. Whether crime as tool could remain effective when confronted by crime as identity. When you're using violence strategically against people who use violence instinctively, you have advantage as long as they play by rules. But the moment they stop playing by rules, The moment they decide overwhelming force is worth any cost, your strategic sophistication becomes vulnerability. You're trying to calculate optimal responses while they're just destroying everything. That was the test coming. Not whether Harlem's elite could govern their community. They'd proven they could. Not whether they could build parallel power structures. They'd already done that. The test was whether sophisticated crime could survive against overwhelming crime. Whether horizontal networks could resist hierarchical organizations. Whether community-embedded power could withstand external force that didn't care about community. The answer to those questions would determine whether Harlem's elite persisted as independent power or became subordinate to white organized crime, whether black people maintained control of their own economic destiny, or saw that control transferred to people who saw them as resources to be exploited rather than communities to be served, whether the parallel power structure would survive or collapse. And critically, the answer depended on something the network couldn't directly control: their ability to interface with white power structures, to negotiate, to find accommodation, to make deals that preserved some autonomy even if they sacrificed complete independence. Because in systems where formal authority exists, informal authority eventually has to negotiate with it. Pretending otherwise is fatal. The question isn't whether to negotiate, it's what terms you can get. Whether you're negotiating from strength or weakness, whether you're shaping outcomes or just minimizing damage. That's where we turn next. To the most complex and most misunderstood aspect of how Harlem's elite maintained power: their negotiations with white power structures, the deals they made, the compromises they accepted, the ways they bent the official system without breaking it. Because resistance isn't always about fighting. Sometimes it's about leverage, about finding pressure points, about making yourself expensive to destroy, about proving that cooperation serves their interests better than confrontation. That's not surrender, that's sophistication. Understanding that power negotiations don't have winners and losers. They have parties who each get enough of what they want, that continued relationship seems preferable to continued conflict. And Harlem's elite became experts at those negotiations, at finding exactly how much they had to give up to keep what mattered, at identifying what white power structures actually cared about versus what they claimed to care about, at threading the impossible needle between resistance and accommodation. There's a photograph in the NYPD archives from 1936 that tells you everything about how violence actually functioned in Harlem's power structure. It's a crime scene photo, a numbers collection point that got robbed. The adding machine is smashed. Papers are everywhere. There's blood on the floor. And in the corner, untouched, sitting perfectly aligned on a shelf, is a stack of ledgers. The robbers took cash. They destroyed equipment. They beat the people present. But they didn't touch the ledgers, because destroying those would have been different. That would have been existential attack rather than tactical robbery. That would have escalated beyond crime into war. And whoever did this robbery understood the difference. This wasn't random violence. This was communication. Someone was sending a message about territorial boundaries, or payment obligations, or respect protocols. They took enough to make their point, but not so much that retaliation became mandatory. They hurt people, but didn't kill anyone. They disrupted operations, but didn't destroy infrastructure. It was calibrated violence. Violence as syntax in a language that everyone in Harlem's underworld understood. The NYPD detective who investigated filed a report noting that none of the victims would cooperate. They all claimed they didn't recognize the attackers, couldn't describe them, didn't know what the robbery was about. The detective found this frustrating. He didn't understand that the victims weren't afraid to talk to police. They were choosing not to talk to police because official intervention would make things worse. Because police response was binary. They either prosecuted criminals or they didn't. But in Harlem's parallel system, there were graduations of response: measured escalation, proportional retaliation. The victims knew who'd robbed them. They knew why. And they knew they'd handle it through unofficial channels that would resolve the underlying dispute without involving authorities who didn't understand the context. 2 weeks later, one of the robbers was hospitalized, beaten severely, but not killed. No charges filed, no police investigation. Just equilibrium restored through reciprocal violence. The system had self-corrected. The initial robbery had been answered. The parties involved had reached understanding. And business continued. This is the economy of violence. Not chaos, not bloodshed for its own sake, but carefully managed exchange where violence served as currency in a market that operated by rules. Official society didn't recognize, but that were nonetheless real and enforceable. You violated someone's territory. You paid in blood or money. You disrespected someone's authority. You got corrected publicly, so everyone saw hierarchy maintained. You broke agreements. You suffered consequences proportional to the violation. And critically, this system required that everyone participated in maintaining it. If one person over-retaliated, if someone responded to minor slight with lethal force, the entire economy collapsed. Because then violence became unpredictable. And unpredictable violence destroys trust, destroys the ability to calculate risk, makes cooperation impossible because you can't assess what any action might cost. Stephanie St. Clair enforced proportionality ruthlessly. When someone in her organization overreacted to a minor provocation, she punished them, not legally, through her own enforcement structure. In 1934, one of her collectors beat a better who couldn't pay, beat him badly enough that he was hospitalized. The beating was unauthorized. The better was a regular customer, someone known to the operation, someone who'd paid consistently for years. He'd had a temporary financial problem. He would have paid eventually. The beating was excessive. St. Clair fired the collector, but more than that, she made sure everyone knew why he was fired. She spread word through the network that he'd violated protocol, that he'd damaged her relationship with a customer over a small debt, that he'd exercised violence without authorization. Within weeks, the collector couldn't find work anywhere in Harlem's underground economy. Not because St. Clair actively prevented it, because everyone understood that hiring him meant accepting someone who didn't understand proportionality, who might create problems that endangered their operations. That's governance, establishing rules, enforcing rules, making examples when necessary to maintain systemic stability. St. Clair wasn't being altruistic. She was protecting her business interests. Excessive violence attracted police attention, made customers nervous, created justification for official crackdowns. So she regulated it. And other major operators did the same because they had the same interests. This created something remarkable, a criminal economy where violence was more regulated than in many legitimate industries. Where rules existed, violations were punished, and participants generally followed protocols because following protocols served everyone's interests. It wasn't perfect. Rules got broken. Disputes escalated. People died. But the baseline was order, not chaos. Structure, not anarchy. Compare this to how the Italian mob operated. Their violence was often excessive, demonstrative, designed to create terror. They'd kill entire families to make points. They'd bomb buildings. They'd create spectacular public violence to establish dominance. That worked for them because they were trying to intimidate populations large enough that subtle signals wouldn't reach everyone. But in Harlem, where everyone knew everyone, where information traveled through social networks instantly, subtle violence was more effective than spectacular violence. Bumpy Johnson understood this perfectly. He developed a reputation for being deadly without actually killing many people. His method was precision. If he needed someone dead, they died quickly, quietly, and the body disappeared. No spectacle, no message sent to wider community, just removal of a problem. But most of the time, he didn't need people dead. He needed them corrected. And correction didn't require killing. His preferred method was economic. He'd identify what someone cared about: their business, their family's security, their reputation. Then he'd threaten that thing. Not with words, with demonstration. You run a club? Suddenly your liquor supplier stops delivering. Your best bartender quits. Your protection payments don't seem to be protecting you anymore. You're not physically hurt, but you're losing money daily. That creates calculation. Continue resisting or accept terms. The math usually favored accepting terms. This is violence as negotiation. You're not trying to destroy the other party. You're trying to change their cost-benefit calculation. Make resistance expensive. Make cooperation profitable. Create situation where rational actor chooses what you want them to choose. That's more sophisticated than just threatening to kill people. Because death threats force binary choice. Resist or submit. Economic pressure creates graduated response option. You can partially cooperate, test boundaries, find compromise. It's more flexible. And flexibility meant sustainability. Because relationships based on absolute force break easily. The moment you can't enforce, people rebel. But relationships based on mutual benefit persist even when power balance shifts. If someone's cooperating, not because you'll kill them, but because cooperation serves their interests, they'll keep cooperating even when you're weak. The Harlem elite built their entire power structure on this principle. They didn't rule through fear alone. They ruled through making themselves useful, through solving problems for people, through creating situations where supporting them was rational choice, even when you weren't forced to support them. Violence enforced the system, but utility sustained it. Consider how numbers operations handled non-payment. Someone placed bets they couldn't cover. In most criminal contexts, that meant beating or worse. But in Harlem's numbers system, it usually meant negotiation. Your runner would talk to you, understand why you couldn't pay. If it was temporary hardship, they'd extend informal credit. If it was pattern of irresponsibility, they'd cut you off from placing future bets. Only if you were deliberately cheating, trying to game the system, would violence enter the equation. This wasn't kindness. It was customer retention. You don't build sustainable gambling operation by terrorizing your customer base. You build it by making them feel respected, by treating them fairly, within the bounds of an admittedly unfair game, by being reliable when they win, and reasonable when they can't pay. That creates loyalty. And loyalty means continued business, means continued profit. The Italian mob didn't understand this because they operated in transactional relationships. They provided protection, or loan sharking, or labor racketeering to people who didn't want those services. Force was necessary because the relationship was inherently extractive. But numbers operations in Harlem were providing a service people actually wanted. People played the numbers voluntarily. They wanted to play. So the relationship wasn't extractive in the same way. It was mutually beneficial, just illegal. That difference mattered enormously. It meant the numbers operations had community support that mafia operations never achieved. It meant police crackdowns faced resistance. It meant politicians who attacked numbers, operators faced electoral consequences. It meant the operations were embedded in community fabric in ways that made them very difficult to remove without damaging the community itself. And violence in this context was protective rather than exploitative. Yes, it was used to maintain territorial control. Yes, it was used to enforce rules. But it was also used to protect the community from external threats. When white gangsters came into Harlem trying to take over operations, violence pushed them back. When police got too aggressive, violence created costs that made aggressive enforcement unsustainable. When other criminals tried to prey on community members, violence provided protection that official police often didn't. This is the complexity that simple narratives miss. Violence in Harlem's power structure was simultaneously oppressive and protective. It maintained an illegal system that caused harm through gambling addiction, but it also defended a community that had no other effective defense mechanism against external exploitation. It was both the problem and the solution, both the harm and the protection from harm. And the people exercising that violence understood the complexity. They weren't thoughtless thugs. They were operators managing complex systems with multiple stakeholders and conflicting pressures. They made terrible choices sometimes. They hurt people who didn't deserve it. They prioritized their interests over community welfare. But they also made strategic choices that protected community interests when protecting community interests aligned with their own. That alignment was the key. When elite interests and community interests overlapped, the elite protected the community. When they diverged, the elite protected themselves. This is how all power structures function, legitimate or illegitimate. The difference is that legitimate power structures have mechanisms for holding leaders accountable when their interests diverge too far from community interests. Elections, legal challenges, media pressure. Harlem's elite had none of those formal mechanisms. They were accountable only through informal mechanisms: loss of community support, vulnerability to rivals, inability to maintain operations without popular acquiescence. Those informal mechanisms worked reasonably well for a while. As long as the elite served community interests often enough, they maintained legitimacy. But the system had no way to remove leaders who stopped serving community interests without waiting for rival criminals to do it through violence. That's the fundamental instability of parallel power structures. Succession happens through conflict rather than process. Leadership changes are violent rather than peaceful, and eventually, that violence becomes destabilizing. By 1936, Harlem's elite network was approaching that instability point, not because of external pressure alone, but because of internal fractures. Different operators had different visions for how to handle increasing federal attention. Some wanted accommodation with white organized crime. Some wanted continued independence at any cost. Some wanted to legitimize their operations through political cooperation. Some wanted to stay completely in the shadows. These weren't just strategic disagreements. They were conflicts about fundamental identity. What was the network for? Was it criminal enterprise focused on profit? Was it community governance providing services the official system denied? Was it resistance to white economic domination? Was it all of those things simultaneously? And if those purposes conflicted, which took priority? No one had answers, because there was no mechanism for collective decision-making. The network operated through consensus when consensus existed, and through fragmentation when it didn't. And as pressure increased, consensus was breaking down. Different operators were making different choices, and those different choices were creating vulnerabilities that external forces would eventually exploit. But before that exploitation, before that eventual collapse, there was one more phase. One more period where the Harlem elite demonstrated their sophistication. When they proved they understood not just how to exercise power within Harlem, but how to interface with white power structures, how to negotiate when negotiation was necessary, how to resist when resistance was possible, how to find the narrow path between submission and destruction. That's the art they perfected in the late 1930s. The ability to engage with official power while maintaining unofficial authority, to cooperate without surrendering, to adapt without breaking. That's where we go next, to the negotiations, the deals, the compromises, the moments when the black elite of Harlem proved they weren't just effective at governing their community. They were effective at navigating systems designed to exclude them, at finding leverage in situations that appeared to offer none, at making white power structures acknowledge black power even when acknowledgement contradicted every principle those structures were built on. The meeting happened in a location that officially didn't exist, not a speakeasy or backroom or hidden office, a lawyer's conference room, completely legitimate. Located on the 10th floor of a building on 42nd Street, 3 blocks from Grand Central Terminal. The kind of place where business deals happened every day. Corporate mergers, real estate transactions, estate planning. Nothing illegal ever occurred there, at least not on paper. The date was September 12th, 1936. Present were 6 people. Hubert Delaney, representing certain business interests in Harlem. James Hines, a white Democratic Party district leader with significant influence over Tammany Hall. An assistant district attorney whose name doesn't appear in any official records. A police captain from the NYPD's 28th precinct. And 2 other men who are listed in the building's sign-in log as consultants, but who everyone in the room knew worked for Lucky Luciano. No official agenda, no minutes taken, no documentation, just 6 men discussing an arrangement that would shape Harlem's political economy for the next 3 years. The conversation lasted 90 minutes, and by the time it ended, power in Harlem had been redistributed without anyone outside that room knowing it had happened. This is how actual power operates. Not through dramatic confrontations or public declarations, through quiet negotiations in legitimate spaces where illegal arrangements get structured using legal language, through conversations that sound like business discussions but are actually territorial treaties, through agreements that exist in implication and understanding, rather than contracts and signatures. Delaney was there representing what he called the existing economic interests in Harlem. Careful language, not criminals, not numbers bankers, economic interests, as if this were about legitimate business concerns, which in a practical sense it was. The numbers operations were businesses, illegal businesses, but businesses nonetheless. They employed people, they generated revenue, they had customers, supply chains, competitive dynamics. Treating them as business entities rather than criminal conspiracies changed the frame of negotiation. Hines was there because he controlled Democratic Party machinery in Harlem, which meant he controlled electoral outcomes, which meant he controlled political appointments, which meant he influenced which laws got enforced and which got ignored. His presence signaled that this wasn't just criminal negotiation. This was political accommodation, the official system participating in structuring the unofficial system. The assistant district attorney represented prosecutorial discretion, the power to decide which cases got pursued aggressively and which ones got handled through plea bargains and reduced charges. His presence meant the legal system was participating, acknowledging that completely eliminating illegal gambling was impossible, that some level of tolerance was necessary, that the question wasn't whether numbers operations would exist, but how they'd be regulated informally. The police captain controlled enforcement on the ground. He determined how many raids happened, when they happened, who got arrested. His presence meant police were willing to coordinate, to maintain the fiction of law enforcement while allowing operations to continue under specific conditions. And Luciano's representatives were there because the Italian mob wanted in. They'd tried force and it hadn't worked. They'd tried intimidation and faced resistance. Now they were trying negotiation, offering partnership rather than demanding submission. And they needed Hines to broker it because Hines had relationships with everyone in the room. The conversation started with Hines framing the problem. Numbers operations in Harlem were generating millions annually. That money was moving through the community without any coordination with the broader organized crime structure in New York. This created inefficiency, competition, occasional violence. Everyone would benefit from better coordination, from clear boundaries, from reducing conflict through formal accommodation. Delaney's response was carefully calibrated. The current operators had built these businesses over decades. They employed thousands of Harlem residents. They provided credit and social services that legitimate institutions didn't provide. Any arrangement would need to preserve local control and community benefit. This wasn't negotiable. This is leverage creation. Delaney was establishing that the operations weren't just profit generators. They were community infrastructure. Disrupt them, and you disrupt an entire neighborhood. Create instability that would require more police presence, more political attention, more problems for everyone at the table. The implicit message: accommodation costs less than confrontation. Luciano's representatives countered. The Italian mob had political connections, police protection, financial resources that dwarfed what Harlem's operators controlled. They could make things very difficult if cooperation wasn't forthcoming. Not threats, just statements of capacity. This is what we can do if we choose to. Consider that in your calculations. Back and forth, for 90 minutes. Each side establishing what they had, what they wanted, what they were willing to trade. Hines mediating. The assistant DA clarifying what legal constraints existed, what flexibility prosecutors had. The police captain explaining enforcement realities. Everyone speaking carefully, using euphemisms, maintaining plausible deniability, but everyone understanding exactly what was being negotiated. The arrangement they reached was complex, but sustainable. Harlem's numbers operators would maintain primary control of their territories, but they'd pay tribute to the Italian mob, not direct payments. That would be too obvious. Instead, they'd purchase certain services from mob-controlled suppliers: liquor for clubs, laundry services, security consulting, revenue flowing to the mob indirectly in ways that looked like legitimate business transactions. In return, the mob would provide higher-level political protection. Hines would ensure that city-level enforcement stayed manageable. The mob's connections to judges would help with case outcomes. Their relationships with union leadership would prevent labor problems. The Harlem operators were essentially paying for access to political and legal infrastructure they couldn't build themselves. The police captain got assurance that violence would be minimized, that territorial disputes would be resolved through this structure rather than through street confrontations, that raids would be coordinated in advance so operators could clear out before police arrived, everyone maintaining the appearance of law enforcement while ensuring enforcement didn't actually disrupt operations. The assistant DA got commitment that organized crime in Harlem would stay relatively low profile. No spectacular violence. No media events that would force aggressive prosecution. In exchange, prosecution would focus on small-time operators who weren't part of the arrangement. The structure would be protected by selectively enforcing law against people outside the structure. And Delaney got preservation of black control over Harlem operations. The tribute was expensive, probably 20 to 30% of revenue flowing out of Harlem to the Italian mob, but operational control remained local. Hiring decisions, day-to-day management, community investment, the things that mattered to Harlem residents stayed in Harlem hands. This wasn't victory. This wasn't resistance. This was accommodation, trading money for autonomy, accepting partial exploitation to prevent total takeover. It was pragmatic calculation about what could be preserved under circumstances where complete independence wasn't possible. And it was sophisticated understanding that power negotiations are about finding acceptable equilibrium, not about winning or losing. The arrangement held for 3 years, from 1936 to 1939. During that period, Harlem's numbers operations continued functioning. Violence decreased. Arrests were predictable and manageable. The community continued receiving benefits from numbers profits, even though significant portions were flowing to the Italian mob. It was stable, profitable for everyone involved, and completely invisible to anyone outside the system. But that invisibility required constant maintenance, required managing media perception, controlling what stories got told, shaping narratives about what was happening in Harlem. Because public attention meant political pressure, meant enforcement that couldn't be contained through backroom deals. The arrangement only worked if most people didn't know it existed. William T. Andrews at the Amsterdam News played a crucial role here. He knew about the arrangement, knew that Harlem operators were paying tribute to the mob, knew that police were cooperating with criminals, knew that politicians were facilitating illegal enterprises. He could have published exposés, could have created scandals that would have forced official intervention, but he didn't. Instead, he published carefully framed stories that shaped public perception without revealing the underlying structure. Stories about community contributions from successful black businessmen. Stories about police crackdowns on crime, when those crackdowns targeted people outside the protected structure. Stories about the vibrancy of Harlem's economy, without details about where that economic vibrancy came from. He was curating reality, presenting a version of Harlem that was true but incomplete. True enough that it wasn't lies. Incomplete enough that it protected the arrangement. This required remarkable editorial judgment. Andrews had to decide constantly what to publish and what to suppress, what served community interests, and what would create problems everyone would regret. He wasn't being controlled by the elite network. He was part of the elite network, making his own calculations about what served the collective interests of people he considered his constituency. Sometimes those calculations meant suppressing stories that would have been journalistically important. In 1937, a reform candidate for city council wanted to run on platform of cleaning up Harlem's organized crime. Andrews wrote editorials opposing him. Not because Andrews supported organized crime, because he understood that cleaning up meant disrupting economic infrastructure that thousands of families depended on, meant replacing black-controlled operations with white-controlled ones, meant creating instability that would hurt more people than it helped. The reform candidate lost badly, and Andrews' role in that loss was invisible to most observers. They just saw black voters rejecting someone who promised to reduce crime. They didn't see the sophisticated political calculus behind that rejection. That community members understood organized crime in Harlem was providing services the legitimate system didn't provide. That removing those services without replacing them would make things worse, not better. This is elite power at its most sophisticated, not controlling outcomes through force. Controlling narratives through information management. Shaping elections through voter mobilization that looked like democratic participation, but was actually coordinated political action. Making the system work for your interests, while maintaining appearance of system working normally. But the arrangement had vulnerabilities. The most significant was that it depended on people who couldn't be fully controlled. James Hines was taking money from everyone, from the Harlem operators, from the Italian mob, from various political candidates, from anyone who needed political favors and could pay for them. His corruption was so extensive that eventually it became visible even to people who weren't looking closely. In 1938, Manhattan District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey started investigating Hines, not because Dewey cared about Harlem specifically, because Dewey was building reputation as corruption fighter. He wanted high-profile prosecutions. Hines was perfect target. Well-connected Tammany Hall politician. Obviously corrupt. Politically vulnerable because Democrats were losing power in New York. Dewey saw opportunity. The investigation threatened everyone. If Hines went down, he might cooperate, might provide details about arrangements he'd facilitated, might name names, might expose the entire structure of how organized crime in New York operated through political protection. Everyone with connections to Hines suddenly faced risk they couldn't fully control. Delaney started preparing, destroying documents, warning clients, creating alibis, making sure that if Hines talked, the information wouldn't lead directly to prosecutions. But there was only so much he could do. The structure was too interconnected. Too many people knew too many details. If prosecution was determined enough, creative enough, they'd find connections. The Harlem Elite Network started discussing contingencies. What if the arrangement collapsed? What if political protection disappeared? What if they had to operate without the buffer Hines provided? Could they survive aggressive enforcement? Could they maintain operations under conditions of real prosecution pressure rather than managed theatrical enforcement? Different people had different answers. Stephanie St. Clair argued for aggressive resistance. Build community support strong enough that enforcement would be politically unsustainable. Casper Holstein advocated for legitimizing operations, finding legal gambling frameworks they could operate within. Others suggested further accommodation with the Italian mob, becoming so integrated that the mob would protect them to protect their own interests. No consensus emerged, because the network had no mechanism for collective decision-making. Each operator would make their own choices, take their own risks, and accept their own consequences. The network would adapt or fracture depending on how those individual choices aggregated. Hines went to trial in 1938. The prosecution detailed extensive corruption, political favors exchanged for cash, protection provided to organized crime operations, testimony from people who'd participated in arrangements similar to what had been negotiated in that conference room in 1936. Hines was convicted, sentenced to prison, and his conviction sent message to every politician in New York. Protecting organized crime was prosecutable. You could go to prison for it. The arrangement that had stabilized Harlem from 1936 to 1939 started collapsing. Politicians who'd been cooperative suddenly became unavailable. Police who'd been flexible suddenly became aggressive. Prosecutors who'd been reasonable suddenly wanted convictions. Not because they'd suddenly developed moral objection to organized crime, because the political calculus had changed. Protecting criminals was now riskier than prosecuting them. The Harlem operators adapted. They increased payments to police. Direct cash rather than going through political intermediaries. More expensive, less reliable, but necessary to maintain any protection at all. They fragmented operations further, making them harder to prosecute because connections were less visible. They reduced visible community involvement. No more public donations from numbers bankers. No more sponsorship of cultural events. Everything going underground. This made them less vulnerable to prosecution, but it also eroded community support because community had tolerated numbers operations, partly because operators were visibly contributing to community welfare. When those contributions stopped, when operations became purely extractive, support weakened. People still played the numbers, but they stopped defending the operators when police cracked down. The social legitimacy that had protected the network started eroding, and the Italian mob saw opportunity. The political protection that had constrained them was gone. The community support that had defended Harlem operators was weakening. The informal rules that had regulated competition were breaking down. They could move more aggressively. Not through direct takeover, they'd learned that lesson, but through increased pressure, higher tribute demands, more control over operations, gradual subordination rather than sudden conquest. Lucky Luciano, operating from prison after his 1936 conviction, was coordinating this through intermediaries. He understood that the moment to increase control was when existing power structures were weakening, when people who'd resisted before were now vulnerable, when new arrangements could be imposed because resistance capacity had diminished. He was patient, strategic, letting circumstances do the work that force hadn't accomplished. By 1940, the balance had shifted significantly. Harlem's operators were paying higher percentages to the mob, had less political protection, faced more aggressive enforcement, were losing community support. The elite network was fragmenting. Some operators were making individual deals with the mob. Others were trying to maintain independence. Others were getting arrested and cooperating with prosecutors to reduce sentences. The parallel power structure that had seemed so robust in 1935 was cracking, not collapsing completely, not overnight, but clearly weakening. The question was whether it could be salvaged, whether new arrangements could be negotiated that would preserve some autonomy, whether the elite could adapt to changed circumstances quickly enough to maintain relevance. Stephanie St. Clair was one of the few who understood the dynamics clearly. She saw that the traditional model was failing, that paying tribute while maintaining operational control was becoming unsustainable, that either you had to fully integrate with the Italian mob, accepting subordinate position, or you had to find completely different business model. There was no middle ground anymore. Her response was characteristic. She chose neither option. Instead, she attacked. Not physically, politically. She started providing information to prosecutors, not about Harlem operators, about the Italian mob, about police corruption, about political protection. She was weaponizing the legal system, using prosecution as tool against the people who were pressuring her operations. In 1939, she sent a letter to Thomas E. Dewey, detailed, specific, naming names, describing arrangements, providing evidence of mob control over Harlem operations, evidence of police payoffs, evidence of political corruption. She wasn't cooperating in traditional sense. She wasn't trying to reduce her own charges. She was attacking the structure that was threatening her autonomy, creating chaos that might create opportunity. The letter was strategic masterstroke. Dewey couldn't ignore it. He was building his reputation on prosecuting organized crime. St. Clair was handing him evidence of extensive mob operations. Even if she was criminal herself, her information was valuable. So Dewey opened investigations, started looking into mob activities in Harlem, started pressuring the very people who'd been pressuring Harlem operators. This created temporary breathing room. The mob had to pull back, reduce their visible presence in Harlem, stop demanding such high tribute, because they were under investigation, because continuing aggressive expansion while being investigated was dangerous. St. Clair had bought time through tactical cooperation with the legal system, not surrendering, engaging, using official power against unofficial competitors. But it was temporary. Investigations take time. Eventually, they conclude. And when they concluded, the pressure would return. Maybe more intense, because the mob would be angry about the interference. St. Clair had won a battle, but the war's direction was clear. The trend was toward consolidation, toward the Italian mob eventually controlling organized crime nationwide, including in Harlem, toward black operators becoming subordinate rather than independent. That subordination wouldn't be complete for another decade. Throughout the 1940s, there was still significant black control over Harlem's numbers operations, still operators who maintained independence, still network coordination, still community investment. But the trajectory was set. The parallel power structure was becoming integrated into the larger organized crime structure. Black elite were becoming middle management in a system controlled by others. This is how informal power structures end, not through dramatic collapse, through gradual subordination, through acceptance of terms that preserve some autonomy in exchange for accepting oversight, through adaptation that looks like survival, but is actually transformation into something fundamentally different. The operators were still there, still making money, still exercising local authority, but they were no longer sovereign. They were operating with permission rather than independently. And the most sophisticated among them understood this, understood that the negotiations they'd conducted so skillfully throughout the 1930s had ultimately been delaying actions rather than permanent solutions. That parallel power only lasts as long as official power allows it to last. That eventually, every informal structure either legitimizes, integrates, or gets destroyed. There's no fourth option. No permanent autonomous space between systems. Some, like Casper Holstein, tried legitimization. He attempted to establish legal gambling operations, get licenses, operate within official frameworks. It mostly failed. The legal system didn't want to legitimize gambling they'd spent decades claiming was immoral. They wanted it to stay illegal so they could selectively enforce law for political benefit. Some, like Bumpy Johnson, chose integration. He started working more closely with the Italian mob, became known as someone who could interface between Harlem and downtown, who could negotiate, who could maintain order in Harlem in ways that served mob interests. He became valuable to the larger structure, and that value bought him protection and autonomy even as overall black control declined. Some, like St. Clair, chose continued resistance. She kept fighting, kept looking for leverage, kept trying to find ways to maintain independence, even as circumstances made independence increasingly impossible. She eventually went to prison, got out, lived in relative obscurity, her operation absorbed by others, her resistance remembered, but not successful. And some, probably most, just adapted to changing circumstances, accepted diminished autonomy in exchange for continued operation, paid higher percentages to the mob, accepted more oversight, gave up community investment to maximize personal profit under constrained conditions, became small business owners in a legal economy rather than community leaders in parallel governance structure. This is the reality of negotiating with white power from position of unofficial authority. You can delay, you can extract concessions, you can preserve partial autonomy, but ultimately, formal power determines the boundaries within which informal power operates. And when formal power decides those boundaries need to change, informal power adapts or disappears. Those are the only options. The black elite of Harlem learned this between 1936 and 1945. They learned that all the sophistication they'd developed, all the relationships they'd built, all the leverage they'd accumulated was contingent, dependent on circumstances they didn't fully control. They could influence those circumstances, could nudge them, could occasionally redirect them, but they couldn't determine them. And when circumstances shifted decisively against them, their power diminished, no matter how skilled they were at negotiation. But that's where most histories stop. With the decline, with the loss of autonomy, with the transformation of independent operators into subordinate ones. What they miss is that the decline wasn't complete. That even in subordination, power persisted. That even after the parallel governance structure was integrated into the larger organized crime structure, black operators still exercised significant authority, just in different forms, with different constraints, serving different purposes. The question isn't whether the black elite of Harlem lost power. They clearly did. The question is what they lost, what they kept, and what that tells us about how power actually works when groups without official authority try to build it anyway. Because the story of Harlem's elite isn't just about rise and fall. It's about transformation, about how one form of power becomes another, about how resistance adapts when it can't win, about what persistence looks like when victory isn't possible. That's where we go next, to the decline, the fracture, the internal divisions and external pressures that couldn't be managed through negotiation alone, to the moment when the parallel power structure stopped being parallel and started being subordinate, to the end of an era and what that ending meant. Not just for Harlem, but for understanding what's possible when people try to govern themselves without permission in systems designed to prevent exactly that. The file was stamped confidential in red ink across the top. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Subject: Negro subversive activities and organized crime in Harlem. Date: January 1941. Inside were 247 pages, documenting meetings, financial transactions, political connections, organizational structures, surveillance photographs, wiretap transcripts, informant reports, the accumulated intelligence of 5 years of systematic federal attention. And on page 1, in the executive summary, was a sentence that explained everything about what was coming. The informal governance structure operating in Harlem represents a challenge to federal authority that requires coordinated interagency response. Not criminal activity, not organized crime. Challenge to federal authority. That's what had changed. The federal government wasn't interested in Harlem because of gambling, or violence, or corruption. They were interested because Harlem had proven that parallel authority was possible, that black people could govern themselves, that unofficial systems could function as effectively as official ones. And that precedent, that proof of concept, was dangerous in ways that simple crime wasn't. This is why informal power structures eventually collapse. Not because they stop working, but because they work too well. They demonstrate that official authority isn't necessary, that people can organize themselves, that governance doesn't require permission from those who traditionally control it. And once that demonstration exists, once people see it's possible, the official system has to destroy it, or risk their own legitimacy being questioned. The FBI's investigation of Harlem wasn't about law enforcement. It was about reasserting monopoly on legitimate governance, making clear that parallel systems wouldn't be tolerated, that the only acceptable authority was official authority. They used criminal prosecution as the tool. But the objective was political, dismantling a structure that challenged the principle that government alone could govern. And they had advantages that local police never had. Federal jurisdiction meant they could investigate across state lines, coordinate with Treasury Department on tax violations, use mail fraud statutes to prosecute gambling operations. They had resources that dwarfed what the NYPD could deploy. They had legal tools that were designed for prosecuting organized crime at scale. And critically, they weren't embedded in local corruption networks. The police in Harlem had been taking money from numbers operators for decades. FBI agents hadn't. They came in clean, uncompromised, determined. But federal intervention was only one pressure. By 1941, the internal structure of Harlem's elite network was fracturing from multiple directions simultaneously. The unity that had made them strong in the 1930s was breaking down. Different operators had different interests, different visions, different calculations about survival. Casper Holstein was increasingly focused on legitimization. He wanted to transform from criminal operator to legitimate businessman. He'd accumulated enough wealth, enough property, enough legitimate investments. He didn't need the numbers racket anymore. What he needed was social respectability, political acceptance, the ability to operate openly without constant threat of prosecution. So he started distancing himself from active criminal operations, keeping the wealth they generated, but abandoning the activities that generated it. This created tension, because Holstein's withdrawal meant other operators lost his political connections, his financial backing, his legitimacy in dealing with white power structures. He'd been crucial broker, someone who could sit in rooms with white politicians and businessmen and be taken seriously. When he stepped back, that bridge weakened. Other operators couldn't replace him because they didn't have his specific combination of wealth, education, cultural capital. His exit diminished the entire network. Stephanie St. Clair was moving in opposite direction. She was doubling down on independence, refusing accommodation, fighting every attempt at subordination, whether from the Italian mob or federal authorities. Her operation was shrinking. She was making less money, facing more legal trouble, but she wouldn't compromise, wouldn't accept that the era of black independent control was ending. Her stubbornness was admirable. It was also strategically counterproductive, because it made her a target, made her the operator federal authorities focused on as example of what happened to people who wouldn't cooperate. Bumpy Johnson was adapting differently. He saw the future clearly. Black operators would never regain the independence they'd had in the 1930s. The only question was whether they'd be subordinate, but operational, or subordinate and destroyed. He chose operation. He started working more closely with the Italian mob, not as equal partner, as valuable lieutenant, someone who could manage Harlem operations on their behalf, who understood the community, who could maintain order, who could be trusted with delegated authority, even if not ultimate control. This was survival strategy, not heroic, not resistance, but practical. Johnson recognized that complete autonomy wasn't achievable, so he negotiated for the best terms possible under constrained conditions. He maintained power by accepting limitation on power, and for him personally, it worked. He remained influential in Harlem for decades, never achieved the independence that St. Clair and Holstein had in their prime, but he survived, prospered, maintained relevance in changing environment. But Johnson's accommodation divided the network, because to many operators, working with the Italian mob wasn't adaptation. It was betrayal, surrender of everything they'd built, acceptance of exactly the subordination they'd fought against. They saw Johnson as collaborator, as someone who'd traded collective black autonomy for personal survival. The network split between people who thought accommodation was necessary and people who thought it was unacceptable. And that split paralyzed collective action. When federal pressure intensified, the network couldn't coordinate response. Some operators wanted to fight through legal channels. Others wanted to go deeper underground. Others wanted to negotiate with authorities. Others wanted to accelerate accommodation with the mob, hoping mob connections would provide protection from federal prosecution. Every operator making individual calculations. No collective strategy. The decentralization that had made the network resilient now made it unable to respond coherently to existential threat. And the threat wasn't just federal. Media attention was intensifying in ways the network couldn't manage. Throughout the 1930s, the Amsterdam News had been able to shape narrative about Harlem, control what stories got told, frame events in ways that protected the network. But by 1940, white newspapers were covering Harlem extensively, and they weren't interested in careful framing. They wanted sensational stories about crime and corruption. They printed details about numbers operations, police payoffs, political protection, details that made prosecution easier and community support harder. William T. Andrews couldn't counter this. The Amsterdam News was influential in Harlem, but not in wider New York. White readers didn't see his editorials, didn't read his careful explanations of how numbers operations served community functions. They read the Daily News and the Herald Tribune, read stories that portrayed Harlem as criminal haven, that described numbers bankers as gangsters exploiting their own community. That created political pressure for aggressive enforcement. The narrative control that had protected the network for a decade evaporated. Suddenly, politicians couldn't afford to be seen as soft on Harlem crime. District attorneys needed convictions. Police commissioners needed to demonstrate they were addressing the Harlem problem. Everyone in official power structure had political incentive to crack down, and the network had no way to counter that pressure because they'd lost control of the story. Then came demographic shifts. Harlem in 1940 was different from Harlem in 1930. The Great Migration was continuing. Population was still growing, but the new arrivals were different. They came from different places, had different expectations, didn't have the same relationships with established power structures. The social networks that had made informal governance possible were diluting, weakening, becoming less dense. In 1930, if you lived in Harlem, you probably knew someone who knew someone in the numbers operation. The degrees of separation were small. Social distance was manageable. That closeness created accountability, created the relationships that made informal systems function. But by 1940, Harlem was too big for that intimacy. Too many people, too much anonymity. The social fabric that had enabled parallel governance was tearing under demographic pressure, and the community itself was changing ideologically. The generation that had built the Harlem Renaissance was aging. Younger people had different perspectives. Some were more politically radical, interested in formal political organization rather than informal power structures. They saw the numbers racket as exploitation, not community service. Saw the elite network as criminal enterprise, not parallel governance. They wanted legitimate political power, electoral representation, legal economic opportunities, not shadow economy and backroom deals. This generational divide weakened community support for the network. When federal agents started making arrests, when prosecutors started building cases, community response was mixed. Some people defended the operators, remembered their community contributions, understood they'd provided services when no one else would. But others welcomed the crackdown, saw it as opportunity to clean up Harlem, to eliminate criminal element, to build legitimate institutions instead of parallel ones. The network found itself fighting without clear popular mandate. Some community support remained, but not the unified resistance that had protected them in the 1930s. They were vulnerable in ways they'd never been vulnerable before, and federal authorities exploited that vulnerability ruthlessly. The prosecutions started in earnest in 1942. Not small-time arrests of runners, systematic targeting of major operators, using federal racketeering statutes, using tax evasion charges, using conspiracy laws that made everyone connected to operations criminally liable. The FBI had spent years building cases. They had evidence, witnesses, documentation. They weren't doing theatrical enforcement. They were doing real prosecution designed to secure convictions. And they were offering deals. Cooperate, provide testimony against others, and receive reduced sentences. Don't cooperate and face decades in prison. The pressure was immense. Operators who'd never considered cooperation suddenly faced choosing between loyalty and survival. Many chose survival, started talking, providing information, testifying against former colleagues. The network that had been so carefully built through relationships and mutual obligation started collapsing as those relationships and obligations broke under prosecution pressure. Stephanie St. Clair was indicted in 1943. Racketeering, tax evasion, operating illegal gambling enterprise. The evidence was overwhelming. Federal agents had documented years of activity, had financial records proving income she'd never declared, had witnesses who'd worked for her and were now cooperating. Her defense was hopeless. Delaney did what he could, legally, but there was no political fix available. No judge who'd dismiss charges. No jury that would ignore evidence. She was convicted, sentenced to 10 years. By the time she was released, her operation was gone, absorbed by others. Her influence vanished, her era definitively over. Other major operators faced similar outcomes. Some were convicted and imprisoned. Some fled. Some cooperated and avoided prison, but destroyed their reputations in the community. Some died. Holstein died in 1944. Natural causes. But he died knowing the world he'd helped build was collapsing, that the parallel power structure was being dismantled, that black independent control of Harlem's economy was ending. The network fragmented completely by 1945. Individual operators still existed. Numbers operations continued, but the coordination was gone. The elite class that had governed Harlem informally no longer existed as a collective. They'd become isolated criminals, trying to survive in an environment hostile to their continued operation. The parallel power structure had become just crime. Illegal activity without the social function that had justified it. Without the community service that had legitimized it. Without the governance role that had made it significant. And the Italian mob moved in. Not dramatically. Not through violence. Through absorption. They offered protection, capital, political connections, in exchange for control. Operators who'd been independent became employees. Operations that had been black-owned became mob-controlled with black managers. The money started flowing out of Harlem instead of circulating within it. The community investment stopped. The social services disappeared. What remained was pure extraction. Gambling that served no purpose except generating profit for people who didn't live in Harlem and didn't care about Harlem's welfare. This is how informal power structures end, through accumulated pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Federal intervention, internal fracture, media exposure, demographic change. Each pressure alone might be manageable. Together, they're overwhelming. The system collapses not because it stops functioning, but because it can't adapt fast enough to changing environment. Can't evolve quickly enough to remain relevant. The specific mechanism of collapse varied by operator, but the pattern was consistent. Loss of community support meant loss of legitimacy. Loss of legitimacy meant vulnerability to prosecution. Prosecution meant arrests, convictions, imprisonment. Imprisonment meant operations had to be restructured. Restructuring under pressure meant accepting terms dictated by people with more power. Usually, the Italian mob. Sometimes federal authorities offering deals. Never on terms the operators would have accepted voluntarily. By 1950, the transformation was complete. Harlem still had numbers operations, still had gambling, still had organized crime, but it was subordinate crime, managed by black operators who reported to white bosses, profits flowing out instead of staying local. No community investment, no parallel governance, no black elite exercising informal authority, just criminal enterprise operating in black neighborhood, exploiting black betters, enriching white gangsters, providing nothing except the opportunity to gamble at terrible odds. The physical infrastructure remained. The buildings were still there. The social institutions still existed. Churches, newspapers, cultural organizations. But they were disconnected from the shadow economy, the financial engine that had driven Harlem Renaissance, that had funded scholarships and cultural awards and community programs, that had provided credit and employment and social services. That engine was dismantled. The money went elsewhere, and Harlem's institutions had to find other funding sources or contract. This is the cost of informal power structures collapsing. Not just that specific individuals lose wealth or freedom, but that entire communities lose the institutions those individuals funded. The parallel systems that developed because official systems failed. When informal power collapses, the services it provided collapse too, and the official system that destroyed the informal system usually doesn't replace those services. So communities end up worse off than before. Harlem in the 1950s had worse crime than Harlem in the 1930s. More violence, less order, because the informal enforcement that had maintained order was gone. The numbers bankers who'd regulated violence. The political fixers who'd mediated disputes. The community leaders who'd maintained stability. They were imprisoned, dead, subordinated, or irrelevant. And no legitimate authority replaced them, because legitimate authority had never wanted to serve that function. They just wanted to prevent anyone else from serving it. This is the tragedy. The parallel power structure had flaws, real flaws. It was built on illegal activity. It caused harm, gambling addiction, wasted money, moral corruption. All of that was real. But it also provided things the official system didn't provide. And when it was destroyed, those things disappeared. The official system claimed victory over organized crime. But what they actually accomplished was transferring organized crime from black control to white control, and eliminating the community services that had made black organized crime tolerable to the community. The residents of Harlem understood this. Many of them had ambivalent feelings about the numbers racket. They knew it was exploitation. They knew it caused problems. But they also knew it provided jobs, credit, social services, protection, things they couldn't get elsewhere. When federal authorities dismantled the black-controlled operations, community members didn't celebrate. They mourned. Not because they loved gambling, because they'd lost institutions that had served them, even if those institutions were built on problematic foundations. But this nuance was lost in official narratives. The story that got told was simple. Federal authorities had cleaned up Harlem, arrested criminals, shut down illegal operations, restored order. It was presented as unambiguous victory, law enforcement succeeding, justice prevailing. The complexity was erased. The fact that what replaced black organized crime was white organized crime. The fact that communities lost services. The fact that power was transferred rather than eliminated. None of that appeared in official accounts. And the precedent was established. Parallel power structures would not be tolerated. Attempts to govern without official permission would be systematically destroyed. The federal government had demonstrated they had tools, resources, and determination to dismantle any informal authority that challenged official authority. The lesson was clear. Stay within official channels, or be crushed. That lesson lasted decades. It shaped how black communities approached power building for the next generation, made people skeptical of informal structures, made them focus on electoral politics, on legitimate business, on working within the system rather than building parallel to it. Whether that was better or worse is debatable, but it was different. The possibility space had contracted. The example of Harlem's elite showed both what was possible and what the costs of that possibility were. Because the black elite of Harlem had proven something important. They'd proven that parallel governance could work. That excluded populations could build sophisticated institutions. That informal authority could be effective. But they'd also proven that informal authority is inherently fragile. That it exists only as long as formal authority permits it to exist. That when formal authority decides to destroy it, it collapses. All the sophistication, all the relationships, all the social capital, none of it was enough to resist sustained pressure from a system with legal authority, more resources, and strategic patience. This is the fundamental limitation of parallel power structures. They can't achieve permanence, can't establish themselves so firmly that they become unchallengeable. They're always provisional, always vulnerable, always dependent on circumstances they don't control. They can persist for years, for decades, can accomplish remarkable things during that time. But eventually, the official system reasserts control. And when it does, the parallel structure collapses. The question isn't whether parallel structures collapse. History suggests they always do eventually. The question is what they accomplish before they collapse. Whether the period of parallel governance creates lasting change. Whether the demonstration of possibility persists even after the specific institutions that demonstrated it are gone. Whether the precedent matters even when the practitioners fail. For Harlem, the answer is complicated. The specific institutions didn't survive. The black elite class was destroyed. The independent control was lost. But the memory persisted. The knowledge that black people had governed themselves, had built economic power, had created sophisticated institutions, had forced white power structures to acknowledge them. That knowledge couldn't be erased. That precedent couldn't be undone. Even after failure, the example remained. and examples shape what people believe is possible, shape what they attempt, shape how they understand their own potential. That's the legacy of Harlem's elite. Not that they built permanent institutions. They didn't. Not that they achieved lasting autonomy. They didn't. But they demonstrated that it was possible at all. That for a period of time, in one place, black people had created parallel power that functioned, that worked, that served community needs even as it caused community harm. The demonstration itself was the accomplishment, the proof that it wasn't impossible, that the barriers were real but not absolute, that with sufficient sophistication, determination, and organization, parallel governance could exist even in a system designed to prevent it. And that demonstration echoes, not just in Harlem, not just in black communities. Everywhere that people excluded from power ask whether parallel institutions are possible, whether unofficial authority can provide what official authority denies. The answer Harlem provided was yes, but not permanently. Yes, but at significant cost. Yes, but with inevitable collapse when formal power decides to intervene. That's not simple? Yes. But it's not simple no either. It's complicated affirmation of possibility, alongside recognition of limitation. That complexity is what histories usually miss. They focus on rise or fall, success or failure, heroes or villains. But the black elite of Harlem were none of those things simply. They were complicated people building complicated institutions in impossible circumstances. They achieved remarkable things. They caused serious harm. They demonstrated black capability. They exploited black vulnerability. They were both impressive and condemnable, both admirable and criminal, both successful and failures. Understanding them requires accepting that complexity, rejecting simple narratives, acknowledging that people can be excellent at terrible things, that institutions can serve communities while harming them. That resistance can require compromise. That survival can demand accommodation. That power is always complicated, always morally ambiguous, always requiring us to weigh benefits against costs without clear formula for how to conduct that weighing. The collapse of Harlem's elite power structure wasn't tragedy in simple sense, wasn't triumph either. It was transformation. The ending of one form of power, the beginning of different forms. The demonstration that parallel governance was possible, followed by demonstration that it was unsustainable. Both lessons matter. Both shaped how subsequent generations approached questions of power and autonomy and community control. And those questions persist. Different contexts, different populations, different specific circumstances, but fundamentally similar challenges. How do you build power when excluded from power? How do you govern when denied permission to govern? How do you serve community needs when official systems fail to serve them? How do you maintain institutions when those institutions must operate outside legal frameworks? How long can parallel structures persist before they collapse or get absorbed? Harlem's elite offered answers to those questions. Answers that worked for a while. Answers that ultimately failed. But answers that demonstrated possibility. That showed what sophisticated, determined people could accomplish even under severe constraints. That legacy persists, not in specific institutions, those are gone, but in the knowledge that it happened, that it was real, that for a time, black people in Harlem governed themselves without permission and made it work better than many expected. That's worth remembering, worth understanding, worth learning from even as we acknowledge its costs and limitations. In 2020, during protests following George Floyd's murder, a sign appeared at a demonstration in Minneapolis. Hand-painted. Simple letters. It read, "We've been policing ourselves longer than you've been policing us." The person holding it probably didn't know about Harlem in the 1930s. Probably didn't know about Stephanie St. Clair or Casper Holstein or the parallel power structures that governed black communities when official governance failed them. But they understood something that Harlem's history makes explicit. Communities excluded from official authority develop unofficial authority. It's not choice, it's necessity. It's what happens when people need order but can't access legitimate institutions that provide it. And unofficial authority always makes official authority uncomfortable. Not because it's inherently violent or criminal, though it often becomes those things, because it demonstrates that official authority isn't necessary, that people can organize themselves, that governance doesn't require permission from those who traditionally control it. That's the threat. That's what must be suppressed, not the specific crimes. The precedent, the possibility, the demonstration that the system isn't inevitable. This is the pattern that repeats. Different contexts, different populations, different specific mechanisms, but fundamentally similar dynamics. Excluded groups build parallel institutions. Those institutions become sophisticated. They provide services official systems don't provide. They develop legitimacy within their communities, and eventually official systems destroy them. Not because they're inherently more harmful than official alternatives, because they challenge monopoly on legitimate authority. Urban communities in the 1960s developed informal systems for resolving disputes, community courts, street justice, mechanisms for maintaining order that operated outside official legal systems. They were inconsistent, sometimes arbitrary, sometimes violent, but they functioned, provided something residents needed, and they were systematically dismantled by police and prosecutors who saw them as threats to official authority. Not because official systems would provide better alternatives, because parallel systems couldn't be tolerated. Rural communities have always had informal governance, particularly in areas where official law enforcement is sparse or absent. Local leaders who mediate disputes, community standards that regulate behavior, unofficial enforcement that maintains order without involving police or courts. This has existed for centuries, and it persists in places where geography or demographics mean official authority is thin. It's tolerated because it's not seen as challenge, because it operates in spaces official authority doesn't want to fill. But the moment it becomes visible, the moment it appears to threaten official authority's monopoly, it gets suppressed. The debate about defunding police that emerged in 2020 is fundamentally about this question. Can communities govern themselves? Can they develop systems for maintaining order that don't rely on state-controlled enforcement? The answer from history, from Harlem specifically, is yes, but not permanently. Yes, but at significant cost. Yes, but only until official systems decide to reassert control. That's not argument against attempting it. It's recognition that informal governance is inherently fragile, always provisional, always vulnerable to suppression when it becomes too effective or too visible. Economic autonomy follows similar pattern. Black Wall Street in Tulsa built a parallel economy. Black-owned businesses serving black customers. Wealth circulating within the community. Financial independence from white-controlled institutions. It was destroyed in 1921, not through market competition, through organized violence. White mobs burned it, killed residents, destroyed infrastructure, and official authorities either participated or stood aside. The destruction wasn't economic, it was political, eliminating demonstration that black economic independence was possible. Chinatowns developed parallel financial systems, rotating credit associations, informal banking, community lending mechanisms that operated outside official financial institutions. They were targeted by regulators, not because they were inherently fraudulent or harmful, because they were informal, because they operated outside official oversight, because they demonstrated that communities could meet their own financial needs without permission from institutions that had historically excluded them. Every population that gets excluded from official institutions develops parallel ones, and every parallel institution that becomes effective eventually faces suppression from official systems claiming monopoly on legitimacy. The specific accusations vary: crime, fraud, corruption, violence. Sometimes those accusations are valid. Often they are. But validity isn't what drives suppression. What drives suppression is that parallel institutions challenge official institutions' claim to exclusive authority. This is what makes Harlem's story relevant beyond its specific context. Not because the numbers racket was good or should be celebrated. It shouldn't. Gambling causes real harm. Addiction, wasted resources, exploitation. All of that was real in Harlem and remains real wherever gambling exists. But the numbers racket also filled vacuum official institutions created, provided credit when banks wouldn't lend, created employment when businesses wouldn't hire, funded community services when government wouldn't provide them. It was simultaneously harmful and helpful, exploitative and service providing. That complexity is what histories usually miss. What simplistic narratives about crime or resistance erase. And that complexity is what makes drawing lessons difficult, because Harlem's elite weren't heroes to emulate. They were criminals who caused harm, but they also weren't simple villains. They built institutions that served real needs. They demonstrated that black people could organize sophisticated systems. They forced white power structures to acknowledge black capability. They did all of this while running illegal enterprises that hurt their own communities. Holding those contradictions simultaneously is necessary for understanding what actually happened and what it means. Modern debates about community control rarely acknowledge this history. When people discuss police abolition or community safety or economic autonomy, they usually don't reference Harlem's parallel governance structures, partly because those structures were criminal, partly because they eventually failed, partly because acknowledging them requires accepting complexity that's uncomfortable. That parallel institutions can be both better than official alternatives and still deeply problematic. That informal governance can serve communities while harming them. That resistance can require compromise. That building power requires moral ambiguity. But that discomfort is precisely why the history matters. Because if you're serious about building alternatives to official systems, you need to understand what happened when others tried it. What worked, what failed, what costs emerged, what benefits accrued, what made it sustainable temporarily, what made it collapse eventually. Those lessons are valuable even when the specific example is troubling. Maybe especially when the specific example is troubling. Because success stories teach less than complicated stories. And Harlem's elite power structure is nothing if not complicated. The question of whether communities can police themselves is a question Harlem answered. Yes, with caveats. They can maintain order. They can resolve disputes. They can provide security their members need. But they do so through mechanisms official society considers illegitimate. Through violence or threat of violence. Through informal enforcement that has no accountability structures. Through systems that work when everyone consents, but break down when some don't. And eventually, official systems intervene. Not because community policing failed, because it worked too well. Because it demonstrated that official policing isn't necessary. That's intolerable to systems built on claiming necessary status. The question of whether communities can build economic independence is a question Harlem answered. Yes, with caveats. They can create financial systems. They can circulate wealth internally. They can generate capital without official institutions, but they do so in ways that leave them vulnerable. Informal financial systems can't scale, can't interface with official economy without becoming visible, can't grow beyond local boundaries. And when they become visible, they get targeted by regulators, prosecutors, or competitors with more resources. Economic independence is possible temporarily. Sustainability requires either legitimization or permanent marginalization. Neither option preserves the independence that made the system valuable initially. The question of whether excluded populations can govern themselves is a question Harlem answered. Yes, with caveats. They can build governance structures. They can make collective decisions. They can enforce community standards. But they do so without legitimacy that comes from official recognition, without legal authority that makes enforcement predictable, without institutional continuity that survives changes in leadership. Informal governance works, but it's fragile, personality dependent, vulnerable to collapse when key individuals are removed. It can accomplish remarkable things temporarily. It can't create permanent institutions that persist across generations. These caveats matter. They're not reasons to avoid attempting parallel institution building. their recognition that parallel institutions face structural challenges that can't be overcome through better strategy or more determination. That informal power is inherently limited. That parallel governance can never achieve parity with official governance because official governance has resources, legitimacy, and permanence that informal governance can't access. Understanding those limitations doesn't mean accepting defeat. It means making realistic assessments about what's achievable and what costs achieving it requires. Harlem's elite understood these limitations better than most people who study them have recognized. They knew they were building temporary structures. They knew their power was provisional. They knew official systems would eventually intervene. They built anyway, accomplished what they could, served their communities as effectively as circumstances allowed. And when collapse came, some adapted, some resisted, some disappeared. But all of them understood that what they'd built was remarkable precisely because it was impossible. Because they'd created governance without permission in system designed to prevent exactly that. That's the legacy. Not specific institutions, those are gone. Not particular strategies. Contexts have changed too much for direct application. The legacy is demonstration. Proof that parallel governance is possible. That excluded populations can build sophisticated institutions. That informal authority can function effectively. That communities can serve themselves when official systems fail them. And simultaneously, proof that parallel governance is fragile. That informal authority is vulnerable. That unofficial systems eventually collapse or get absorbed. That resistance has limits. That power without legitimacy is provisional. Both proofs matter. Both lessons are worth learning. The success teaches what's possible. The failure teaches what's difficult. Together, they provide realistic framework for understanding what communities can accomplish when excluded from power and what obstacles they'll face in attempting to accomplish it. That's more valuable than simple success stories or simple failure stories. Because reality is complicated. Power is complicated. Resistance is complicated. And any honest assessment has to acknowledge that complexity without resolving it into simple narratives. Modern communities facing similar exclusions can learn from Harlem, can understand that building parallel institutions is possible, but never permanent. That informal governance works but always remains vulnerable. That economic autonomy is achievable temporarily, but sustainability requires compromise. These aren't reasons for despair. They're recognition that the work is harder than idealistic narratives suggest. That success requires understanding constraints as clearly as possibilities. That building parallel power means accepting that you're building something fragile, something provisional, something that will likely be destroyed or absorbed eventually. And choosing to build it anyway, because it serves needs official systems won't address. Because it demonstrates capability official narratives deny. Because temporary success is better than permanent acquiescence. That's what Harlem's elite chose. Temporary power over permanent powerlessness. Provisional authority over no authority. Fragile institutions over no institutions. They built knowing it wouldn't last. Built knowing official systems would intervene. Built knowing they'd likely lose everything eventually. And they built anyway. Because building was resistance. Because demonstration was victory, even when institutions collapsed. Because proving it was possible mattered even when the proof couldn't be sustained indefinitely. There's a reason this history isn't widely taught. Not because it's unknown. The documentation exists. The records are accessible. Scholars have written about it. The information is there for anyone who looks. But it's not in standard American history curricula. Not in high school textbooks. Not in the narratives most people learn about Harlem Renaissance, or Great Migration, or organized crime in America. Because teaching this history requires acknowledging something uncomfortable, that governance doesn't require official permission, that excluded populations can build effective institutions outside official frameworks. That parallel authority can function as well as or better than official authority in specific contexts. And those acknowledgments undermine every justification for why official authority should have monopoly. on legitimate governance. If you teach that Harlem governed itself effectively in the 1930s, you're teaching that government isn't necessary for governance, that communities can organize themselves, that unofficial systems can work. And once people learn that lesson, they start asking dangerous questions. Why do we need official systems if unofficial ones can function? Why should we accept official authority if parallel authority serves us better? Why should we participate in systems that exclude us when we can build systems that include us? Those questions threaten every existing power structure, not just in 1930s Harlem, everywhere, always. Because every system of governance depends on claiming necessary status, on arguing that the alternative to official authority is chaos, that without them, society collapses. The existence of functioning parallel systems disproves that claim, shows that alternative to official authority isn't chaos. It's alternative authority. Different governance, not absence of governance. So the history gets marginalized, not erased. That would be too obvious. Just made peripheral, made about crime rather than governance, about gangsters rather than institutions, about individual personalities rather than systemic alternatives. The narrative gets shaped so that lessons learned are safe lessons. Lessons about criminal behavior and law enforcement and moral failure. Not lessons about parallel power structures and community self-governance and the fragility of official authority's claim to exclusive legitimacy. But the history persists in community memory, in family stories, in the way older residents of Harlem talk about back when, with nostalgia that confuses people who don't understand they're not being nostalgic for crime. They're being nostalgic for community control, for a period when Black people in Harlem made decisions about Harlem, when power over their lives and their neighborhood resided in people who looked like them, lived among them, understood their needs. The nostalgia isn't for numbers rackets, or violence or exploitation. It's for autonomy, for self-determination, for the brief period when their community wasn't subordinate. That nostalgia itself is politically dangerous, because it suggests that official governance was worse than unofficial governance. That legitimate authority served communities less effectively than illegitimate authority. That's not supposed to be possible. Official narratives insist that formal systems are always superior to informal ones, that legal authority always serves communities better than illegal authority, that government always governs better than people can govern themselves. Harlem's history suggests otherwise, suggests that sometimes, in specific contexts, excluded populations build institutions that serve them better than official institutions do. Not because those parallel institutions are inherently superior, because they're responsive to different incentives, accountable to different constituencies, focused on different objectives, and in contexts where official institutions are hostile or indifferent, parallel institutions can absolutely function more effectively from the community's perspective. This is what makes the history threatening. Not that criminals built empires. That happens everywhere. But that criminals built governance structures, provided community services, created order, made themselves indispensable to community functioning, and did so more effectively than official government was doing. That's the lesson that can't be taught safely. Because once people understand that parallel governance is possible, they start evaluating official governance differently. Start asking whether it serves them or serves itself. Start questioning whether they need permission to organize themselves. Every marginalized population that learns Harlem's history learns that parallel institution building is option. Difficult option. Dangerous option. Option that likely ends in suppression or absorption. But option nonetheless. Alternative to waiting for official systems to change. Alternative to accepting permanent exclusion. You can build your own institutions. Govern your own communities. Exercise authority without permission. It won't last forever. It'll be fragile, provisional, constantly threatened. But it's possible. Harlem proved it's possible. And that possibility changes calculations, changes what people attempt, changes how they think about power and authority and community organization. Even if most people who learn the history never attempt to replicate it, The knowledge that it happened shapes what they believe is achievable, expands the possibility space, provides precedent for resistance that doesn't require permission. This is why the legacy matters. Not because we should romanticize numbers rackets or celebrate criminals. We shouldn't. The harm was real. The exploitation was real. The violence was real. None of that should be minimized or excused. But we also shouldn't pretend that what Harlem's elite built was only criminal enterprise. It was also governance, also institution building, also community service, also demonstration of black capability that official narratives insisted didn't exist. It was all those things simultaneously, and refusing to acknowledge the governance aspects because the criminal aspects were also real is intellectually dishonest. Honest assessment requires holding contradictions. Acknowledging that the same people who ran numbers rackets also funded the Harlem Renaissance. That the same systems that exploited gambling addiction also provided credit to families who couldn't get bank loans. That the same networks that used violence also maintained order more effectively than police. That institutions can be simultaneously harmful and helpful, exploitative and service providing, criminal and governmental. Most historical narratives can't handle that complexity. They need heroes or villains, success or failure, resistance or collaboration. But Harlem's elite were none of those things simply. They were people navigating impossible circumstances, building what they could with resources available to them, making terrible choices because all available choices were terrible, accomplishing remarkable things while causing serious harm, being brilliant and destructive simultaneously. That's not unique to them. That's human. That's how people function under extreme constraint. They don't make morally pure choices. They make possible choices. And possible choices under conditions of extreme exclusion and systemic oppression are never going to be choices that look morally acceptable from comfortable distance. But dismissing those choices as simply criminal or celebrating them as simply resistance both miss what actually happened. What actually happened was complicated, morally ambiguous, simultaneously admirable and condemnable. The question isn't whether Harlem's elite were good or bad. That's an unanswerable question. They were both. The question is what their existence, their accomplishments, their eventual failure teach us about power and governance and community organization, about what's possible when people are excluded from official authority, about what happens when they build parallel authority anyway, about how long parallel systems can persist before official systems destroy them, about what that persistence and that destruction tell us about how power actually works. And what it tells us is uncomfortable. It tells us that official authority depends on monopoly, that legitimacy is social construction rather than natural fact, that governance can happen without permission, that communities can organize themselves effectively, that parallel institutions work until official institutions decide to destroy them, all of which undermines every claim official systems make about their own necessity and inevitability. That's why this history isn't taught, why it's marginalized as crime story rather than governance story, why the complexity gets flattened into simple narratives about gangsters and law enforcement. Because the actual history, with all its complexity and moral ambiguity and demonstration of parallel governance, is too dangerous to official power structures to be widely disseminated. It has to be contained, made safe, transformed into cautionary tale about criminal behavior rather than instructive tale about community self-governance. But containing the history doesn't erase what happened, doesn't undo the demonstration, doesn't eliminate the precedent. Harlem governed itself for decades without official permission, built institutions that worked, served community needs, exercised authority, made decisions, maintained order, and did all of it outside official frameworks, in ways official narratives insist are impossible. The fact that those institutions eventually collapsed doesn't negate that they functioned. The fact that they were criminal doesn't mean they weren't also governmental. That's the legacy we don't name, the one we can't quite acknowledge, because acknowledging it requires admitting too many uncomfortable truths about how power works, about who gets to exercise it, about what happens when excluded populations exercise it anyway, about how official systems respond when parallel systems emerge, about whose authority gets considered legitimate and whose gets criminalized, about whether the difference between legitimate and illegitimate authority is actual moral distinction, or just question of who has power to make those determinations. Harlem's elite forced those questions into existence, not through theory or philosophy or political organizing, through demonstration, through building parallel power structures that worked well enough, long enough, to prove they were possible. And once something's proven possible, the knowledge persists even after the specific example is destroyed. You can't make people forget that it happened, can't make them unlearn what Harlem demonstrated, can only try to control what lessons get drawn from it. The lesson official narratives want drawn is simple. Crime doesn't pay. Criminals get caught. Justice prevails. Order is restored. Simple moral lesson that reinforces official authority's legitimacy. But anyone who looks closely at what actually happened learns different lessons, learns that parallel governance is possible, that unofficial authority can function, that communities can organize themselves, that power doesn't require permission. Those lessons are dangerous. Those lessons change what people attempt. Those lessons threaten every official claim to exclusive legitimate authority. So the history gets told carefully, with emphasis on crime, with focus on individual personalities, with framing that makes it about moral failure rather than systemic response to exclusion. All of which is partially true, but all of which obscures larger truth that Harlem's elite weren't aberration. They were predictable response to predictable conditions. When you exclude populations from official power, they build unofficial power. When you deny them legitimate authority, they create illegitimate authority. When you refuse to let them participate in governance, they govern themselves anyway. That pattern repeats throughout history. Different contexts, different populations, different specific mechanisms, but same fundamental dynamic. And Harlem is one of the most sophisticated, most documented, most successful examples of that pattern. That's why it matters. Not as moral lesson, as empirical demonstration, as proof that parallel governance is viable response to exclusion, as evidence that official authorities' claim to monopoly is contingent, not absolute, as precedent that can't be undone even though the specific institutions that set the precedent were destroyed. 3 hours ago, we started with a photograph. 12 people outside the Renaissance Casino in 1928, dressed like royalty, surveilled like criminals, governing Harlem without permission, building institutions that would last a decade before collapsing under combined pressure from federal authorities, internal fractures, and white organized crime. But those 12 people and the broader network they represented accomplished something that official narratives still can't quite erase. They proved it was possible. They proved black people could build sophisticated institutions, could organize complex systems, could govern effectively, could exercise authority, could create order, could serve communities, all without permission from white power structures, all outside official frameworks, all in ways the system insisted were impossible. And they didn't just theorize about it, they did it. For decades. Successfully enough that it required sustained, coordinated federal intervention to dismantle. That demonstration matters. That proof of concept persists. Not in specific institutions, those are long gone, but in knowledge that it happened, that it was real, that for a period of time, in one neighborhood, excluded population built parallel power structure that functioned, that served community needs, that forced official power to acknowledge its existence, even if official power never acknowledged its legitimacy. Harlem wasn't lawless. It was governed, just not by people America elected, just not through systems America authorized, just not in ways America could control. And that governance worked, imperfectly, problematically, with real costs and serious harms. But it worked, provided services official government wouldn't provide, maintained order official police couldn't maintain, created opportunities official economy denied. made community decisions when official decision makers ignored community needs. That's the legacy. That's what we don't quite name. That's what makes this history uncomfortable. Because naming it clearly requires acknowledging that governance doesn't require official permission, that communities can organize themselves, that parallel authority is a viable alternative to official authority under certain conditions. And once you acknowledge those things, every official claim to exclusive legitimate authority becomes questionable. Every insistence that the alternative to official governance is chaos becomes suspect. Every demand that excluded populations wait for permission to participate in power becomes untenable. Harlem's elite didn't wait, didn't ask, didn't accept exclusion as permanent. They built power anyway, exercised authority anyway, governed anyway. And though they ultimately failed, though their institutions collapsed, though their independence was lost, they demonstrated that it was possible. That excluded populations could build what official systems denied them. That parallel governance could function. That communities could serve themselves when official institutions wouldn't serve them. That demonstration can't be undone. That knowledge can't be erased. That precedent can't be eliminated. It exists. It happened. And every excluded population that learns about it learns that they have options. Difficult options. Dangerous options. Options that likely end in suppression or absorption, but options nonetheless. Alternatives to waiting. Alternatives to accepting. Alternatives to permanent exclusion from power. That's what Harlem's black elite gave us. Not through what they accomplished, though that was considerable, through what they demonstrated. That governance without permission is possible, that it's fragile, that it's provisional, that it won't last forever, but that it's possible. And sometimes possibility is enough. Sometimes demonstration matters more than duration. Sometimes proving it can be done is more important than how long it lasts before it's destroyed. Harlem wasn't lawless, it was governed, just not by people America elected. And for a while that worked.